He's been selling his blood just to keep a roof over his daughter's head. But when the phlebotomist who's been taking it turns out to be a secret billionaire, everything he thought he knew about survival is about to change, and so is his life. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Jake's alarm blared at 5:30 a.m., its harsh sound cutting through the darkness of his small bedroom. He reached out with heavy arms to silence it, feeling the familiar ache in his muscles from yesterday's late shift at the warehouse. The springs of his worn mattress creaked as he sat up, running a hand over his tired face. Through the thin walls of their apartment, he could hear the gentle breathing of Emily in the next room. The sound brought a small smile to his face, despite his exhaustion. She was the reason he kept going, the light that made every struggle worthwhile. In the cramped kitchen, Jake flipped on the fluorescent light, wincing at its harsh glare. Bills were scattered across the small table, final notices in bold red letters, payment reminders, and a particularly worrying envelope from their landlord. He gathered them quickly, stuffing them into a drawer. Emily didn't need to see those. "Let's see what we've got," he muttered, opening the nearly empty refrigerator. Half a carton of eggs, some milk that was close to expiring, and bread that had seen better days. It would have to do. As he started making breakfast, the smell of toast and scrambled eggs filled the small space. The clock on the microwave showed 6:15 a.m. when he heard Emily's bedroom door open. "Morning, Dad," she said, already dressed in her school clothes, her backpack hanging from one shoulder. "Morning, sunshine." Jake's voice softened as he looked at his daughter. Her dark hair was slightly messy, and she still had sleep in her eyes, but she was trying so hard to be grown up. "You're up early. I heard your alarm." Emily sat at the table, pushing aside a stray bill that had escaped Jake's cleanup. "Is that all the eggs we have?" Jake's heart clenched at the question. "Just enough for both of us," he said, keeping his tone light. "And look, I made the toast extra crispy, just how you like it." Emily smiled, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She was too young to shoulder such concerns, yet too observant to miss them entirely. He placed a plate in front of her, making sure she got the larger portion of eggs. "Dad, you need to eat more than that," she protested, seeing his meager serving. "This is plenty for me, sweetheart." Jake sat across from her, his coffee the only thing keeping him upright. "I had a big dinner at work last night." It was a lie. He'd skipped dinner to save food for Emily's lunch today. They ate in comfortable silence, the morning sun slowly creeping through their kitchen window. Jake watched as Emily carefully spread jam on her toast, using the back of her spoon to make it even, just like her mother used to do. The similarity made his throat tight. "Don't forget, it's pizza day at school," Emily said, breaking into his thoughts. "Can I have $3 for lunch?" Jake's stomach dropped. He'd forgotten about pizza day. Reaching for his wallet, he found only a $5 bill, the last of their cash until next week. "Here you go, sweetie," he said, handing it to her. "Get yourself something nice for dessert, too." Emily's face lit up, but then fell slightly as she looked at the bill. "But Dad, don't you need this?" "I've got plenty," he lied again, hating how easily the untruths came now. "Come on, finish up. We need to get you to school." After dropping Emily off, Jake headed straight to the blood bank. The waiting room was already half full when he arrived, other desperate faces avoiding eye contact. Jake signed in, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote his name. The nurse called him back after 20 minutes. As she prepared his arm, Jake tried not to think about how this was his second donation this week. The guidelines recommended waiting longer between donations, but rent was due in 3 days. "You're looking a bit pale," the nurse commented, concern in her voice. "Have you been eating properly?" "Just tired," Jake assured her, forcing a smile. "Long week at work." The needle slid in, and Jake watched his blood flow through the tube. Each drop was bringing him closer to making rent, to keeping a roof over Emily's head for another month. The room seemed to spin slightly, but he gripped the armrest and steadied himself. 40 minutes later, Jake stumbled out of the blood bank, $70 richer, but considerably weaker. The afternoon sun felt too bright, and his steps were unsteady as he made his way home. His arm ached where the needle had gone in, and his empty stomach protested the loss of blood. The walk home seemed longer than usual. Jake had to stop twice to rest, leaning against buildings as waves of dizziness washed over him. People passed by, some giving him concerned looks, but no one stopped to help. He was used to that by now. As he climbed the stairs to their third-floor apartment, Jake's legs felt like lead. Each step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. But he kept going, one foot in front of the other, thinking of Emily's smile when she got home from school, thinking of the pizza she'd enjoyed today, and how the rent would be paid on time. Finally reaching their door, Jake fumbled with his keys. Inside, he collapsed onto their worn couch, still clutching the envelope with his blood money. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it would keep them going for now. That's all that mattered. He closed his eyes, allowing himself just a moment of rest before he had to get up for his afternoon shift. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical thing, but beneath it all was the certainty that he'd do it again tomorrow if he had to. For Emily, he'd do anything. Jake's hands trembled as he tried to balance his phone against his ear while keeping a firm grip on Emily's small backpack. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as they made their way to Emily's elementary school. "Yes, Mr. Peterson, I understand the delivery needs to be there by noon," Jake said into the phone, trying to keep his voice steady despite his exhaustion. His muscles screamed from his earlier shift at the warehouse, where he'd spent hours loading boxes onto trucks. Emily skipped beside him, her ponytail bouncing with each step. She hummed quietly to herself, used to these morning work calls that interrupted their walks to school. Jake gave her hand a gentle squeeze, grateful for her patience. "I can absolutely handle that route, sir," Jake continued, even though his body begged for rest. "Yes, right after my current shift ends." He fought back a yawn, knowing he couldn't afford to show any weakness. Not when this job was one of the three keeping them afloat. They reached the school entrance, where other parents and children bustled about. Emily turned to him with her bright smile, the same one that reminded him so much of her mother. "Have a good day, sweetie," Jake said, quickly covering the phone's microphone. He bent down, ignoring the protest in his lower back, and hugged her tightly. "I love you. Love you too, Daddy," Emily replied, giving him an extra squeeze before running off to join her friends. Jake watched her disappear into the building before returning to his call. "Sorry about that, Mr. Peterson. Yes, I'm still here." The rest of his morning passed in a blur of heavy boxes and clipboard signatures. By afternoon, his hands were raw from handling rough cardboard, and his work shirt was soaked with sweat. The warehouse's ventilation system had broken down again, turning the massive space into an oven. "Turner," his supervisor called out, "need you to stay an extra hour." Johnson called in sick. Jake's heart sank. He'd planned to use that hour to rest before his evening shift at the convenience store. But he couldn't say no. Not with rent due and bills piling up. "Sure thing, boss," he managed, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The extra hour stretched into 2. By the time Jake finally clocked out, his legs felt like lead. He checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Mrs. Martinez, their elderly neighbor who watched Emily after school. His stomach clenched with guilt as he dialed her number. "I'm so sorry," he said the moment she answered. "I got held up at work. I'm heading home now." "No worries, Jake," Mrs. Martinez replied kindly. "Emily's doing her homework. She's such a good girl." Jake's throat tightened. Emily was good. Too good, really. Never complaining about their tiny apartment or the fact that he couldn't afford the new shoes she needed for gym class. The bus ride home was a torture of stops and starts, each jolt sending fresh waves of pain through his overworked body. Jake counted the loose change in his pocket. Just enough for tomorrow's bus fare. He'd have to walk to his evening shift tonight to save money. As he approached their apartment building, the setting sun painted the brick facade in shades of orange and red. It might have been beautiful if Jake hadn't been so focused on the peeling paint and crumbling concrete steps. The building had seen better days, just like him. Standing there, staring up at their third-floor window, Jake felt the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a physical force. He'd managed to scrape together this month's rent, but only barely. The envelope in his pocket felt thin, inadequate. Inside their apartment, Emily sat at the kitchen table, concentrated on her math homework. Mrs. Martinez waved goodbye, refusing Jake's attempt to pay her something for watching Emily. Her kindness made his chest ache. His eyes drifted to the kitchen counter, where the pink eviction notice still sat, its harsh warning visible even from across the room. 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. The word seemed to pulse with menace in the dim kitchen light. Jake's hands shook as he pulled out the rent money he'd collected from his various jobs. Even with today's extra hours, even with taking every available shift, it wasn't enough. Not really. This month's rent would clean out their meager savings, leaving nothing for groceries or Emily's school supplies, or the electricity bill that was already past due. The anxiety that had been building all day crashed over him like a wave. His breathing quickened as he stared at that pink notice, his vision blurring around the edges. They were one missed paycheck, one unexpected expense, one sick day away from losing everything. Emily's pencil scratched against her paper as she worked, oblivious to her father's distress. Jake watched her, his heart heavy with love and fear. She deserves so much better than this. Better than a father who could barely keep him housed. Better than hand-me-down clothes and missed parent-teacher conferences because he couldn't get time off work. The eviction notice mocked him from its place on the counter. He'd pay the rent tomorrow, buy them another month in this run-down apartment, but the relief would be temporary. Next month's notice loomed like a shadow on the horizon, and Jake had no idea how they would face it. His muscles ached from the day's labor. His head pounded from stress. And still, he had another shift to work tonight. Standing in their small kitchen, surrounded by bills and worried notices, Jake felt completely trapped. The walls of their apartment seemed to close in around him, a cage built of poverty and desperation. He looked at the clock. In 2 hours, he'd need to leave for his night shift at the convenience store. 2 hours to help Emily with homework, make dinner, and try to rest his battered body. It wasn't enough time. It was never enough time. The pink notice continued to sit there, a reminder of how close they were to losing everything. Jake's hands clenched at his sides as anxiety churned in his stomach. He needed a solution, something more than just scraping by month after month. But as he stood there, exhausted and aching, no answers came. Jake stared at the familiar glass doors of the blood bank, his reflection showing dark circles under his eyes. The fluorescent sign above read, "Life Solutions Blood Services," casting a pale glow in the early morning light. His arm still ached from his last donation, but the rent deadline loomed larger than his discomfort. Inside, the waiting room was eerily quiet. The usual morning crowd hadn't arrived yet, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the soft hum of the air conditioning. The reception area smelled of antiseptic and coffee, a combination that made his empty stomach churn. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," the receptionist greeted him with practiced cheerfulness. "Here for another donation?" Jake nodded, forcing a tired smile as he signed the familiar forms. His signature looked shakier than usual, and he tried to steady his hand. The papers felt heavy in his grip, consent forms that he'd signed too many times lately. "Your vital signs first," she reminded him, gesturing toward the small medical station. Jake sat in the hard plastic chair, rolling up his sleeve. The blood pressure cuff felt tight around his arm, and he watched the numbers on the digital display with apprehension. The receptionist frowned slightly at the reading, but said nothing. "Someone will be with you shortly," she said, adding his paperwork to a thin folder. Jake slumped in one of the waiting room chairs, trying to ignore the slight dizziness that had become his constant companion. The medical posters on the walls seemed to mock him, smiling faces promoting health and wellness while he was here selling his blood to keep a roof over his daughter's head. "Mr. Reynolds?" A new voice called his name, different from the usual staff. Jake looked up to see a tall man in a pristine white coat. Unlike the other phlebotomists, this one carried himself with an air of authority that seemed out of place in the modest clinic. His name tag read Thomas, and his presence commanded attention without effort. "If you'll follow me," Thomas said, his voice calm and reassuring. The treatment room was like all the others, sterile, white, with a reclining chair in the center. But Thomas's methodical movements made the familiar space feel different somehow. "I see you've been visiting us quite frequently," Thomas remarked, reviewing Jake's file. His tone wasn't judgmental, just matter-of-fact. Jake shifted uncomfortably in the chair. "Times are tough," he said simply, not meeting Thomas's eyes. Thomas nodded, preparing the equipment with precise movements. "How's your energy level been?" he asked, his eyes sharp and observant. "I managed," Jake replied, though his body screamed otherwise. "Your previous readings show you're right at the minimum acceptable hemoglobin levels," Thomas said. Wrapping the tourniquet around Jake's arm, his touch was gentle but confident. "We need to make sure we're not doing more harm than good here." Jake tensed. "I need this," he said quietly, hating how desperate he sounded. "My daughter." Thomas held up a hand, his expression softening. "I'm not turning you away, Mr. Reynolds. I'm just concerned about your well-being. This isn't a long-term solution." The needle slid in smoothly. Thomas was clearly skilled at his job. Jake watched the dark red liquid flow through the tube, trying not to think about how many times he'd seen this same sight recently. "You know," Thomas said, adjusting the flow rate, "there are other ways to improve one's situation." His voice had an odd quality to it, as if he was choosing his words carefully. Jake gave a bitter laugh. "Not many options when you're barely keeping your head above water." Thomas watched the blood bag fill, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the best opportunities aren't the obvious ones." He paused, checking the collection progress. "Would you believe me if I told you I started in a situation not unlike yours?" Jake studied Thomas's expensive-looking watch and perfectly pressed coat. Honestly, no. A slight smile crossed Thomas's face. Life has a way of surprising us. He began the process of removing the needle, his movements precise and gentle. After applying pressure to the collection site, Thomas helped Jake sit up slowly. "How are you feeling?" "A bit lightheaded," Jake admitted, "but I'll be fine." Instead of dismissing him like the other phlebotomists usually did, Thomas reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a business card, the paper thick and expensive looking. "Mr. Reynolds, I should tell you something," Thomas said, holding the card but not yet extending it. "I'm not just a phlebotomist here. I own Life Solutions, along with several other medical research companies." Jake blinked, trying to process this information through his post-donation fog. The card in Thomas's hand seemed to catch the fluorescent light, the embossed letters gleaming. "This isn't just a blood bank," Thomas continued, finally holding out the card. "We're doing important research here, developing new treatments, new possibilities." He paused, making sure Jake was looking at him. "And I think you might be interested in being part of that." Jake took the card, feeling the weight of the expensive paper between his fingers. The logo was simple but elegant. Life Solutions International, with Thomas's full name and title beneath it. "I don't understand," Jake said, staring at the card. "You don't need to understand everything right now," Thomas replied, his voice kind but firm. "Just know that I might be able to help you more than just taking your blood twice a week." Jake stood up slowly, tucking the card into his wallet. For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than exhaustion and despair. A tiny spark of possibility. "Think about it," Thomas said, opening the door. "And Mr. Reynolds, take care of yourself. We'll talk soon." Jake walked out of the blood bank into the morning sunlight. His arm ached where the needle had been, but his steps were lighter than when he'd arrived. The business card seemed to burn in his wallet, carrying with it the weight of unexpected opportunity. Jake sat at his small kitchen table, Thomas's business card between his fingers. The white rectangle seemed to mock him as he turned it over and over, the embossed letters catching the dim light from above. Life Solutions Research Division, it read, with a phone number underneath. Simple, professional, mysterious. His gaze drifted to the stack of bills piled near the edge of the table. The red final notice stamp on the electricity bill made his stomach clench. Emily's school photos lay nearby. He still hadn't been able to afford even the smallest package. "What kind of research?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The memory of Thomas's confident smile and pristine lab coat floated in his mind. There had been something different about him, something that set him apart from the other medical staff at the blood bank. Jake pulled out his phone. Its screen cracked from the time he dropped it, rushing between jobs. The number on the card seemed to grow larger as he stared at it. His thumb hovered over the keypad. "Just make the call," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion. "For Emily." Before he could talk himself out of it, he punched in the numbers. Each ring made his heart beat faster. He was about to hang up when a familiar voice answered. "Thomas speaking." Jake's throat went dry. "Hi, this is Jake Reynolds. From the blood bank?" "Ah, Jake." Thomas's voice warmed considerably. "I was hoping you'd call. How are you holding up?" The genuine concern in Thomas's voice caught Jake off guard. "I'm managing. Would you be interested in meeting for coffee? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. The daily grind on 5th Street, perhaps?" Jake glanced at his watch. He had 2 hours before his evening shift at the warehouse. "When? How about now? I can be there in 15 minutes. Jake hesitated, looking around his small apartment. Emily was at her after-school program. He had time. "Okay, I'll see you there." The Daily Grind was a modest coffee shop, nothing fancy, but still nicer than anywhere Jake had been lately. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the rich scent of coffee enveloped him. Thomas was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 steaming cups. "I took the liberty of ordering for us," Thomas said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Americano, black. You strike me as a simple coffee kind of man." Jake sat down carefully, noting how Thomas's crisp blue suit contrasted sharply with his own worn jeans and faded work shirt. "Thank you, but you didn't have to. Consider it an investment in our conversation." Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "How's your daughter? Emily, isn't it?" Jake's guard went up immediately. "How do you know her name?" "It's in your donor paperwork," Thomas replied smoothly. "Family medical history is important information for blood donation." Jake wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup, trying to ground himself. "Right. Of course. Jake, I'll be direct. I've been watching your donations over the past few weeks. Your blood work is interesting. Thomas leaned forward slightly. And I don't just mean medically. There's something unique about your genetic profile. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What does that mean? It means I have a proposition for you. Thomas pulled out a folder from his briefcase. I'm prepared to offer you a job, one that pays significantly better than your current positions combined. Jake's heart skipped a beat. What's the catch? Smart man. Thomas nodded approvingly. The catch is that we'd need regular access to your blood for our research project, more frequent than standard donation guidelines allow. Is that legal? Completely. We have all the necessary permits and oversight, but it's experimental, which is why we need willing participants. Thomas slid the folder across the table. The compensation package is on the first page. Jake opened the folder, and his eyes widened at the number. It was more than triple what he currently made. This can't be real. It's very real, Thomas assured him. We're developing new treatments using AI-assisted blood analysis. Your genetic markers make you an ideal candidate for our research. Jake's mind raced. The money would solve so many problems. The rent, Emily's school supplies, maybe even some savings for her future. But something about it felt too good to be true. How often would you need my blood? Twice a week, small samples, nothing that would affect your health. We monitor everything carefully. Thomas took a sip of his coffee. You'd also have a regular position at our facility. Real work, not just as a test subject. Jake stared into his coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. And what exactly would you be testing for? I can't discuss the specifics without proper documentation, but I assure you it's nothing harmful. Thomas's voice remained steady, professional. Think of it as being part of something bigger than yourself, something that could help a lot of people. The coffee shop's ambient noise seemed to fade away as Jake considered the offer. He thought about Emily's worn-out shoes, the field trips he couldn't afford, the way she pretended not to be hungry when he served smaller portions to make the food last longer. I'd need to think about it, Jake said finally. Of course. Thomas pulled out another business card, this one black with silver lettering. Take the weekend. Call me Monday if you're interested. He stood up, straightening his suit jacket. Just remember, Jake, sometimes the things that seem too good to be true are actually opportunities in disguise. Jake looked down at the folder again, then back at Thomas. The man's expression was open, patient. Something in Jake's chest loosened slightly. Okay, Jake said quietly. I'll do it. Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. You're sure? You don't want to take the weekend? Jake shook his head. I can't afford to wait that long. If this is real, I need it now. A small smile played at the corners of Thomas's mouth. Welcome aboard, Jake. He extended his hand across the table. Jake hesitated for just a moment before reaching out to shake it. His calloused palm met Thomas's smooth one, and the deal was sealed. Jake stood before the gleaming glass building, its modern architecture stretching toward the morning sky. The address matched the one Thomas had given him, but this wasn't what he'd expected. Gone were the sterile white walls of the blood bank. Instead, he faced what looked like a tech company's headquarters. His worn work boots scraped against the polished concrete as he made his way to the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing a lobby that seemed to glow with ambient light. A sleek reception desk curved along one wall, staffed by two professionally dressed women. I'm here to see Thomas, Jake said, his voice sounding rough against the quiet hum of the building. He tugged at his faded jacket, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. The receptionist smiled. Mr. Barrett is expecting you. Please scan this visitor badge and follow the green lights on the floor. Jake clipped the badge to his jacket, watching as a path of subtle green lights illuminated along the pristine floor. He followed them through a maze of corridors, each more impressive than the last. Glass walls revealed laboratories where people in white coats moved with purpose. Surrounded by equipment he couldn't begin to understand. The lights led him to an elevator that opened automatically. Inside, classical music played softly as he ascended to the 5th floor. When the doors opened, Thomas stood waiting, his usual composed smile in place. Welcome to Nexus Biotech, Jake. Thomas gestured around them. This is where the real work happens. Jake's eyes traveled over the space. Unlike the sterile environment of the blood bank, this floor hummed with energy. Screens displayed complex data streams, and through the glass walls, he could see rows of sophisticated machinery. I don't understand, Jake said. What exactly do you do here? Thomas led him through a set of security doors. We're pioneering new medical treatments, combining artificial intelligence with biological research. Your blood donations have already shown promising markers. They entered a medical room that looked nothing like the blood bank. The chair was more like something from a spa, with soft leather and adjustable positions. A young technician in blue scrubs approached with a warm smile. "This is Sarah," Thomas said. "She'll be handling your blood work today." Jake sat in the chair, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. The equipment around him looked expensive, with screens displaying information he couldn't comprehend. Sarah worked efficiently, explaining each step as she prepared his arm. "We'll be taking several small samples today," she said, her voice gentle. "Each one will be processed differently." The needle slid in smoothly. Sarah was clearly skilled at her job. Jake watched as vial after vial filled with his blood, each marked with different colored caps and labels. The process took longer than his usual donations, but the chair was comfortable, and Sarah kept checking to make sure he felt okay. Thomas moved between various screens, occasionally making notes on a tablet. His presence was both reassuring and unsettling. The man carried himself with such confidence, but there was something in his eyes that Jake couldn't quite read. "How are you feeling?" Thomas asked, pausing beside the chair. "Fine," Jake replied, though his head felt slightly light. "But I still don't understand why my blood is special." Thomas's expression remained neutral. "Everyone's blood tells a story, Jake. Yours. Well, let's just say it's particularly interesting to our research." After the final vial was filled, Sarah helped Jake sit up slowly and provided him with juice and cookies. "Take your time," she said. "There's no rush." While Jake recovered, Thomas disappeared into an adjoining office. He returned moments later with an envelope. "As promised," Thomas said, holding out the envelope. "You'll find this compensation more substantial than what you received at the blood bank." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The check inside made his breath catch. The amount was more than he'd make in 2 weeks at his current jobs. "This is too much," he said, looking up at Thomas. "It's exactly what your contribution is worth." Thomas's voice was firm. "And as I said, this is just the beginning. We'd like to see you twice a week if you're willing." Jake stared at the check again. The amount would cover his rent with money left over for groceries. He could maybe even buy Emily those new shoes she needed. But something about all this felt off. The secretive nature, the high-tech facility, the excessive payment for blood samples. "What's the catch?" Jake asked, his voice quiet but steady. Thomas's smile didn't waver. "No catch. We're simply willing to pay for quality. Your blood has properties that could help advance our research significantly." Jake stood up slowly, tucking the check into his pocket. The weight of it seemed to burn through his jeans. He looked around the room one more time, at the expensive equipment, the pristine surfaces, the screens filled with data he couldn't understand. "When do you need me back?" he asked, already knowing he couldn't turn down this opportunity despite his reservations. "Thursday," Thomas replied. "Same time. Sarah will help you schedule your appointments." As Jake followed the green lights back to the lobby, the check felt heavy in his pocket. The money would solve his immediate problems, but new questions swirled in his mind. What made his blood so special? What was Thomas really looking for? He pushed through the glass doors into the morning sun, feeling both relieved and uneasy about what he'd just agreed to. Jake sat in the familiar chair at the blood bank, watching as the crimson liquid flowed through the clear tube. 2 weeks had passed since his first visit to Thomas's research facility, and he'd settled into a routine. Twice a week, like clockwork, he'd come here after his morning shift at the warehouse. Thomas approached, his white coat pristine as always. "How are you feeling today, Jake?" He checked the collection bag with practiced efficiency. "Better than usual," Jake admitted. The extra money had meant he could cut back on his night shift at the convenience store. "Actually, getting some sleep these days." Thomas nodded, making notes on his tablet. "Your blood pressure has improved since you started with us." His voice carried its usual mix of professional detachment and genuine interest. "And how's Emily?" Jake couldn't help but smile. "She's doing great. Started an after-school art class last week." He paused, remembering how her eyes had lit up when he told her she could join. "Never thought I'd be able to afford something like that." "Children need enrichment activities," Thomas said, his expression softening slightly. "It's good you can provide that now." As they talked, Jake noticed other donors watching them. Thomas rarely spent this much time with anyone else. The special attention made Jake uncomfortable, but he couldn't deny the benefits of their arrangement. Later that week, Jake returned to the research facility. The security guard now knew him by name, and the lab technicians greeted him with familiar nods. Everything felt routine, except for the nagging questions that grew louder with each visit. In the sterile examination room, Jake rolled up his sleeve while Thomas prepared the equipment. The markers in your blood are showing fascinating patterns, Thomas commented, swabbing Jake's arm with alcohol. What kind of patterns? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Thomas's response was typically vague. Patterns that could help a lot of people. He inserted the needle with practiced precision. You're doing important work here, Jake. The words should have been reassuring, but they weren't. Jake thought about the stack of non-disclosure agreements he'd signed, the careful way Thomas avoided direct questions about the research. The money was good, better than good, but what was he really participating in? That evening, Jake watched Emily doing her homework at their kitchen table. She wore the new shoes they'd bought last weekend, her legs swinging happily as she worked on her math problems. The apartment felt warmer now, with a full fridge and paid bills. No more collection notices. No more choosing between electricity and food. But the guilt gnawed at him. Was he selling more than just his blood? Was he setting a good example for Emily? She deserved more than just material comfort. She deserved a father she could be proud of. Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. Additional session tomorrow? Double compensation. Emily looked up from her homework. Can we get pizza tonight, Dad? Her smile, so bright and hopeful, made his chest ache. Sure, sweetie. How about we walk to Antonio's? As they walked to the pizza place, Emily chatted about her art class, her hand warm in his. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows. Jake made his decision. The next day, he arrived at the research facility earlier than usual. Thomas was in his office, surrounded by screens displaying complex data patterns. Jake, Thomas said, looking up with mild surprise. You're early. Jake closed the office door behind him. We need to talk, Thomas. Thomas gestured to a chair, his expression unreadable. Of course. Why me? Jake asked, remaining standing. Out of all the people who come through your blood bank, why did you choose me for this project? Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with those penetrating eyes. You're wondering if there's a catch. Wouldn't you? Jake's voice rose slightly. The money, the special treatment, it doesn't add up. What's really going on here? I understand your suspicion, Thomas said calmly. In your position, I'd probably feel the same way. That's not an answer. Thomas stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Jake, I've built my career on recognizing potential in people, in research, in opportunities. He turned back to face Jake. When I met you, I saw someone who needed help but wouldn't accept charity. Someone who would work himself to death for his daughter. So this is charity? Jake felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. No, Thomas said firmly. This is an investment. Your blood has unique properties that are valuable to our research. The compensation is fair for what you're providing. I'm not exploiting you, Jake. I'm trying to help while conducting legitimate research. Jake wanted to believe him. The steady certainty in Thomas's voice was convincing, but doubt still lingered. And you can't tell me more about this research? Not yet, Thomas replied. But I promise you, everything we're doing here is legal and ethical. You're helping us develop treatments that could save lives. He paused, his expression softening slightly, including Emily's, should she ever need them. Jake sank into the chair, suddenly tired. I need to know I'm doing the right thing here, Thomas, for Emily's sake. You are, Thomas said. Sometimes help comes in unexpected ways. Don't let pride or suspicion stand in the way of what's best for your family. Jake looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk. Emily would be finishing her art class soon. He thought about her new shoes, her smile, the way she hummed while doing homework now, instead of worrying about the lights going out. The research, he said finally. Will you tell me when you can? As soon as it's possible, Thomas assured him. For now, trust that you're part of something important. Jake nodded slowly, not fully satisfied, but willing to continue. For now, Emily's happiness would have to be enough of an answer. Jake stared through the car window at Thomas's mansion, his stomach churning with uncertainty. The sprawling estate stretched before him, its manicured lawns and elegant architecture making him feel smaller with each passing second. He tugged at his borrowed tie, a leftover from happier times when he and his wife would occasionally dress up for date nights. His weathered sedan looked desperately out of place next to the gleaming luxury cars in the circular driveway. Jake took a deep breath, remembering Emily's encouraging words before he left. You look handsome, Daddy, she had said, helping him smooth down his jacket. The babysitter he'd splurged on for the evening had already settled in with Emily when he departed. The massive front door opened before Jake could even reach for the doorbell. Thomas stood there, dressed casually in comparison to Jake's formal attire. Jake, welcome, he said warmly, gesturing inside. Please, come in. Jake stepped into an entrance hall that could have fit his entire apartment. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors, and artwork he couldn't begin to understand adorned the walls. "Your home is..." Jake struggled to find the right words. "Impressive." "It's too much space for one person," Thomas admitted, leading Jake through to what appeared to be a living room. "Can I offer you a drink?" "Just water, thanks." Jake perched awkwardly on the edge of an expensive-looking leather armchair, his posture rigid. Thomas returned with 2 glasses of water, settling into a chair across from Jake. "You seem tense," he observed, his eyes studying Jake with that familiar, analytical gaze. "I'm not used to..." Jake gestured vaguely at their surroundings. "All this. Neither was I once upon a time," Thomas replied, his voice softening slightly. "Would you believe I grew up in a 2-room apartment with my mother?" Jake's eyebrows rose slightly, but before he could respond, a uniformed staff member appeared to announce dinner was ready. They moved to a dining room where a table that could seat 12 was set intimately for 2. "I hope you like Italian," Thomas said as they were served their first course. "The chef makes an excellent risotto." Jake nodded, carefully mimicking Thomas's movements with the various pieces of silverware. The food was extraordinary, but he found it hard to fully enjoy it under the weight of his discomfort. "Tell me about Emily," Thomas said suddenly, breaking a stretch of silence. The mention of his daughter immediately brought warmth to Jake's expression. "She's everything to me," he said simply. "Smart as a whip, kind-hearted. She's had to grow up too fast since her mother passed, but somehow she still manages to find joy in everything." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Children are remarkably resilient." He paused, setting down his fork. "Jake, I imagine you're wondering why I invited you here tonight." "The thought had crossed my mind," Jake admitted, tension creeping back into his shoulders. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "What I'm about to tell you might sound fantastic, but I ask that you hear me out completely." He took a sip of water before continuing. "My company isn't just a blood bank. We're at the forefront of revolutionary medical research, combining biotechnology with artificial intelligence." Jake listened intently as Thomas explained how they used blood samples to develop new treatments for various diseases, creating personalized medicine through AI analysis. "The samples we've collected from you," Thomas continued, "show remarkable properties that could help advance our research significantly." Jake's fork clattered against his plate. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means your blood has unique characteristics that make it valuable for our studies," Thomas explained. "But more importantly, it means I've had the opportunity to observe you, Jake. Your dedication, your integrity, your determination to provide for your daughter despite impossible odds." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm just doing what any father would do." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You're doing what an exceptional father does, which brings me to why you're here tonight." He reached for a folder that had been placed discreetly on a side table. "I'd like to offer you a position at my company." Jake's breath caught in his throat. I don't have the qualifications for..." "You have exactly the qualifications I'm looking for," Thomas interrupted. "Intelligence, integrity, and the ability to learn quickly. The position would include full benefits, a substantial salary increase from your current jobs combined, and most importantly, stability for you and Emily." Jake stared at the folder Thomas had placed before him, his mind racing. The offer seemed too good to be true, and in his experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. "Why me?" he asked finally, looking Thomas directly in the eyes. "Because I see potential in you, Jake. Potential that's being wasted on multiple dead-end jobs." Thomas's voice carried a conviction that was hard to dismiss. "This isn't charity. This is an investment in someone I believe can be valuable to my company." Jake picked up the folder with slightly trembling hands, scanning the details of the offer. The salary figure made his head spin. It was more money than he'd seen in years. "Take it home," Thomas said, rising from the table. "Review it carefully. Discuss it with Emily if you'd like. But know that this is a genuine offer, one that could change both your lives for the better." As Jake stood to leave, clutching the folder like a lifeline, he found himself torn between hope and suspicion. The drive home seemed surreal, the weight of the opportunity sitting heavy in his hand. Could this really be the answer to his prayers? Or was there something he wasn't seeing? The lights of his modest apartment building came into view, and Jake parked in his usual spot. The contrast between where he'd been and where he was now stark and jarring. He sat in his car for a long moment, the folder resting in his lap, wondering if he dared to believe in this chance at a better life. Jake adjusted his new tie, one he'd actually bought himself, not borrowed, as he walked through the gleaming glass doors of Thomas's research facility. The security guard, Mike, gave him a friendly nod, and handed over his employee badge. The plastic card with his photo and Jake Matthews, research consultant, printed on it, felt strange but reassuring in his hands. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," the receptionist called out with a warm smile. It had been years since anyone had called him anything but Jake or Emily's dad. His new office, though modest compared to others in the building, was bigger than his entire living room at home. A sleek computer sat on a modern desk, and the wall-to-wall windows offered a view of the city he'd never seen before. Jake set down his worn briefcase, another item he'd need to upgrade soon, and took a deep breath. Settling in, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his usual composed self in an impeccable suit. "Still feels a bit surreal," Jake admitted, running his hand along the smooth desktop. "You'll get used to it." Thomas stepped into the office. "Ready to begin?" The morning passed in a blur of meetings and introductions. Jake met the research team he'd be working with, all brilliant scientists who somehow made him feel welcome despite his lack of formal qualifications. They valued his perspective as someone who'd been on the other side of the testing process. During lunch break, Jake sat in the company cafeteria, marveling at the quality of food available. He pulled out his phone and found a text from Emily. "Hope your first day is awesome, Dad. Can't wait to hear all about it. Dar." His daughter had been overjoyed when he told her about the new job. "A real office job?" she'd exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. "Like in the movies?" The memory of her pride made his heart swell. The afternoon brought his first real task, reviewing the blood donation process from a donor's perspective. Jake found himself drawing on his own experiences, suggesting ways to make the process more comfortable and less intimidating for people in desperate situations. "These are excellent insights," Thomas said during the team meeting, nodding approvingly at Jake's suggestions. "This is exactly why we needed someone with your background." By the end of his first day, Jake felt exhausted, but in a different way than his previous jobs had left him. This was mental fatigue rather than physical, and it came with a sense of accomplishment rather than defeat. As weeks passed, Jake settled into a routine. He could now afford to drive Emily to school in a reliable used car he'd purchased. Their apartment, while still modest, had new furniture and a fully stocked fridge. Emily's wardrobe no longer consisted of hand-me-downs, and Jake had even started a small college fund for her. One morning, about a month into his new job, Emily hugged him especially tight before school. "I'm really proud of you, Daddy," she whispered. "Mom would be too." Jake had to swallow hard before responding. "Thank you, sweetie. I'm doing my best." At work, Jake's confidence grew as his suggestions were implemented and praised. The donation centers were being redesigned with his input, making them more welcoming and less clinical. His team respected his opinions, and he found himself speaking up more in meetings. Thomas remained an enigma, though. While always cordial and supportive, he kept a professional distance. Jake would occasionally catch him observing the team through glass walls, his expression unreadable. One evening, Jake stayed late to finish some paperwork. As he walked through the quiet halls, he passed by Thomas's office and noticed the light still on. Through the partially open door, he could hear Thomas speaking on the phone. "Yes, the integration is proceeding as expected," Thomas was saying. "Subject shows remarkable adaptability." "Yes, exactly as we predicted. The emotional variables are particularly interesting." Jake quickened his pace, his footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. Something about Thomas's clinical tone made him uneasy. That night, back in his apartment, Jake sat at his new kitchen table long after Emily had gone to bed. He looked around at the improvements they'd been able to make. The fresh paint on the walls, the new appliances, Emily's art supplies scattered across her desk. Their life had improved dramatically in just a few weeks, yet something nagged at him. He pulled out his employee badge and studied it. The job was real, the money was real, and the work they were doing seemed legitimate, but Thomas's words from earlier echoed in his mind. Subject shows remarkable adaptability. Jake walked to Emily's room and watched her sleeping peacefully, clutching the new teddy bear he'd bought her last weekend. The stability they now enjoyed meant everything to him. Emily was happier than she'd been in years, and he was finally able to provide for her the way she deserved. Still, as he got ready for bed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Thomas's interest in him than simple professional development. The man's motives remained as unclear as they had been that first day at the blood bank. Jake was grateful for the opportunity, but he couldn't help wondering what Thomas really wanted from him. He set his alarm for the next morning, hanging his new suits neatly in the closet. Another recent purchase. Whatever Thomas's true intentions might be, Jake had to admit that this job had given him and Emily a chance at a better life. For now, perhaps that would have to be enough. Jake adjusted his new tie, one he'd actually bought himself, not borrowed, as he walked through the gleaming glass doors of Thomas's research facility. The security guard, Mike, gave him a friendly nod and handed over his employee badge. The plastic card with Jake's photo still felt strange in his hands, a symbol of how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. The elevator carried him to the 5th floor, where his small but tidy office waited. It wasn't much, just a desk and some filing cabinets, but it was more than he'd ever had before. Pictures of Emily decorated one corner, her bright smile reminding him why he was here. "Morning, Jake." Thomas's voice came from the doorway. He stood there in his usual crisp suit, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully. "Thanks. Still getting used to the early meetings. You'll adjust." Thomas settled into the chair across from Jake's desk. "How's Emily doing with the new schedule?" "Better than expected. The after-school program's been great. She actually likes it." Jake took a sip of coffee, noting how Thomas always remembered exactly how he took it. "She asked about you yesterday." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Wanted to know if you'd come to her school play next month." "She's playing a tree." Jake chuckled, remembering Emily's excitement about her non-speaking role. Something flickered across Thomas's face. Surprise. Maybe even pleasure. I'd like that, actually." They spent the next hour reviewing test results and financial projections. Jake was still learning the ropes, but he found he had a knack for spotting patterns in the data. Thomas seemed pleased with his progress, occasionally nodding in approval. During a lull in their discussion, Thomas stood and walked to the window. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly, staring out at the city below. "Who's that?" "My father, actually. Not the man who raised me. He left when I was 4. Thomas's shoulders tensed slightly. "The man who gave me my first job, owner of a small electronics store. He saw something in me when nobody else did." Jake set down his coffee cup, surprised by this personal revelation. "What happened to him?" "Cancer. Died before I could really thank him." Thomas turned back to face Jake. "He taught me that success isn't just about making money. It's about lifting others up along the way." The words hung in the air between them. Jake felt a sudden urge to share something of his own. "After my wife died," he began, "I thought I'd never trust anyone again. Kept thinking I had to do everything alone." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We're similar that way. Building walls to keep people out." "Emily was the only one who got through," Jake admitted. "But lately." He trailed off, not sure how to express his growing trust in Thomas without sounding unprofessional. "I know," Thomas said simply. They spent the rest of the morning going through reports. Jake found himself relaxing into their routine, appreciating how Thomas would explain complex concepts without making him feel stupid. Around noon, they ordered lunch from the cafe downstairs, something that still felt luxurious to Jake. "Your insights on the testing protocols are impressive," Thomas said between bites of his sandwich. "You have an instinct for this work." Jake felt a warmth of pride, quickly followed by a familiar twinge of doubt. Was Thomas just being kind because of their arrangement? Because Jake's blood was valuable to whatever research they were doing? As if reading his thoughts, Thomas added, "I mean that, Jake. This isn't about the testing program anymore. You're good at this." Jake wanted to believe him. The past few weeks had shown him a different side of Thomas, someone who could be surprisingly gentle, who remembered small details about Emily, who seemed genuinely interested in Jake's opinions. After lunch, Jake returned to reviewing the quarterly reports. Something caught his eye in the financial statements, a series of large transfers to an unnamed research division. The amounts seemed odd, not matching any of the projects he knew about. "Thomas?" he called out, but his office was empty. Jake pulled up more files, trying to trace the money trail. The numbers didn't add up. When he attempted to access more detailed records, a security warning flashed across his screen. "Finding everything okay?" Thomas's voice made him jump. He stood in the doorway again, his expression carefully neutral. "Oh yeah, just looking at the quarterly numbers," Jake said, trying to sound casual. "There are some transfers I don't quite understand." "Ah, those are from our private investors," Thomas said smoothly. "Nothing to worry about. Why don't we focus on the new testing schedule?" Jake nodded, but something felt off. Thomas's usual openness had vanished, replaced by a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork, but Jake couldn't shake his unease. As he packed up to leave, Jake glanced at Emily's pictures on his desk. He thought about how much better their life had become: the full fridge, the paid bills, Emily's new clothes. He thought about Thomas's story of his mentor, about the genuine warmth in their conversations, but he also thought about those mysterious transfers, about Thomas's quick dismissal of his questions. Walking to his car, Jake wondered if he was being naive. Maybe this wasn't about friendship at all. Maybe he was just another part of Thomas's business plan, a useful resource wrapped in a feel-good story of helping the less fortunate. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Jake reached his car. He pulled out his phone to check the time Emily would be waiting at the after-school program. His finger hovered over the text messages from Thomas, full of kind words and thoughtful questions about their lives. Jake sighed, tucking the phone away. He wanted to trust Thomas, wanted to believe in the friendship that seemed to be growing between them, but those numbers in the financial records nagged at him, a splinter of doubt he couldn't quite ignore. Jake stared at the spreadsheets on his computer screen, trying to make sense of the numbers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows, and the gentle hum of the building's air conditioning system filled the quiet space. He'd been at it for hours, reviewing financial reports that Thomas had asked him to analyze. A muffled voice from the conference room next door caught his attention. Thomas was speaking to someone, his usually measured tone raised slightly. Jake tried to focus on his work, but the words filtered through the thin walls. "The cellular regeneration rates are unprecedented," Thomas was saying. "We've never seen anything like it in our previous trials." A deeper voice responded, unfamiliar to Jake. "But the ethical implications, Thomas. The board is concerned about the methods we're using to collect the samples." Jake's fingers froze over his keyboard. He glanced at the wall separating him from the conversation. "The donors are well compensated," Thomas replied firmly, "and the results speak for themselves. Look at these markers. The AI analysis shows a clear pattern in the blood samples from our specific demographic." "You mean the desperate ones?" the other voice asked sharply. "Single parents living paycheck to paycheck?" Jake's heart thumped harder in his chest. He leaned closer to the wall, barely breathing. "Their circumstances are irrelevant," Thomas said. "What matters is that their blood contains exactly what we need. The stress markers, the cellular adaptations, it's all there. And with the new treatment protocol, which hasn't been approved by any regulatory body," the other man cut in. "We're operating within legal guidelines," Thomas insisted. "The potential benefits far outweigh any temporary discomfort to the subjects." Jake's stomach churned. Subjects? Is that what they were? What they all were? And what about the side effects we've observed? The other voice pressed. "The unexplained fatigue, the minor issues," Thomas interrupted. "Nothing compared to the breakthrough we're on the verge of achieving. Think about it, Richard. We could revolutionize human enhancement, make people stronger, more resilient." The sound of chairs scraping against the floor made Jake quickly return to his computer screen. Footsteps approached the conference room door. "Just keep the board happy," Thomas was saying as the door opened. "I'll handle everything else." Jake pretended to be absorbed in his work as Thomas and his guest, a tall man in an expensive suit, walked past his office. His mind was racing, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. The weekly blood donations, the careful selection of donors, the mysterious fatigue he'd been feeling lately. He waited until the end of the day, when most of the staff had left. The cleaning crew hadn't arrived yet, and the building was quiet except for the soft whir of computers. Jake stood in Thomas's office doorway, watching his boss friend review documents on his tablet. "Got a minute?" Jake asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Thomas looked up, his face brightening. "Of course, come in. How are those reports coming along?" Jake closed the door behind him and remained standing. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Thomas's expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. He set down his tablet. "What's on your mind?" "What are you really doing with our blood?" Jake asked directly. "And don't tell me it's just standard medical research." A long moment passed. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with those penetrating eyes. "You heard my conversation with Richard." It wasn't a question. Jake nodded. "Then you know we're working on something revolutionary," Thomas said carefully. "Something that could help countless people. By experimenting on desperate people's blood?" Jake's voice rose slightly. "By targeting single parents who need money?" Thomas sighed, standing up and walking to the window. The city lights twinkled below, a constellation of artificial stars. "It's more complicated than that, Jake. The work we're doing here, it's going to change lives, make people better, stronger, help them survive impossible circumstances. Like the circumstances you created by paying people to drain their blood twice a week?" Jake challenged. Thomas turned, his face hardening slightly. "You've been well compensated. Your life has improved significantly since you started working here." Isn't that what you wanted? The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought about his new apartment, Emily's new clothes, the ability to buy groceries without counting pennies. But at what cost? I want to know exactly what you're doing with our blood, Jake insisted. What kind of treatment are you developing? Thomas walked back to his desk, his movements deliberate. I've given you opportunities nobody else would. A chance to better yourself, to provide for your daughter. I thought you understood the value of what we're doing here. That's not an answer, Jake pressed. No, Thomas agreed, his voice cooling. It's not, and for now, that's all I can give you. The work we're doing is confidential, and it needs to stay that way. If you're uncomfortable with that, well... He let the implication hang in the air. Jake felt the weight of the threat unspoken but clear. His new life, everything he'd built in the past few weeks, balanced on a knife's edge. He thought of Emily, happy in their new apartment, proud of her dad's new job. So that's it? Jake asked quietly. Just trust you and don't ask questions? Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Trust has brought you this far, hasn't it? Don't let paranoia undo everything we've accomplished together. Jake stood there for a moment longer, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, he turned and walked to the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty office. As he rode the elevator down to the parking garage, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line, one that he couldn't step back from. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and questions without answers. He needed this job, needed the stability it provided for Emily. But as he parked his car, he couldn't help wondering if the price was higher than he'd originally thought. Jake watched Emily push her breakfast around her plate, something she never did. Her usual chatty morning demeanor was replaced by quiet lethargy. Her face looked paler than usual, and dark circles had formed under her eyes. You feeling okay, sweetheart? Jake reached across the small kitchen table and pressed the back of his hand against her forehead. His heart skipped a beat. She was burning up. Emily's lower lip trembled. I don't feel good, Daddy. Jake got up from his chair so quickly it scraped against the floor. He knelt beside her, his protective instincts taking over. What hurts, baby? Everything. Her voice was barely a whisper. My head feels funny, and I'm cold. She leaned against him, her small body shivering despite wearing her warmest pajamas. Jake wrapped his arms around her, feeling the heat radiating through her clothes. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it just a flu? Something worse? The not knowing made his stomach churn. Let's get you back to bed, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He scooped her up, remembering when she used to giggle at being carried. Now she just buried her face in his shoulder, too weak to protest. In her room, Jake tucked Emily under her favorite purple blanket, surrounded by her stuffed animals. He found the children's thermometer in the bathroom cabinet, the one with the little duck on it that usually made her smile. This time, she barely noticed it. The digital display blinked. 103.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Jake's hands trembled as he read the number. Too high. Way too high. Emily, sweetie, we need to go to the hospital. He tried to sound calm, but panic crept into his voice. She nodded weakly, her eyes glassy with fever. Jake grabbed her emergency bag, the one he'd packed when she was born and kept updated out of habit, and helped her into clean clothes. Every movement seemed to drain more energy from her small frame. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and worried glances in the rearview mirror. Emily dozed in her car seat, her head lolling to one side. Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated morning traffic, his heart pounding with each passing minute. The emergency room was crowded, but one look at Emily's condition, and they were quickly ushered into an examination room. A nurse with kind eyes took Emily's vitals, while Jake answered questions, his voice shaking as he described her symptoms. Has she been exposed to anyone who's been sick? The nurse asked. No, I don't think so. She was fine yesterday. Jake ran his fingers through his hair, trying to remember any warning signs he might have missed. She ate dinner, did her homework. Everything was normal. The doctor arrived. Dr. Martinez, according to her name tag, and began examining Emily. Jake watched helplessly as she shined lights in Emily's eyes, pressed the stethoscope to her chest, felt along her neck and abdomen. We'll need to run some tests, Dr. Martinez said, her expression carefully neutral. Blood work, chest x-ray, maybe a spinal tap if necessary. Jake's throat tightened. A spinal tap? What? What are you looking for? It's probably just a severe viral infection. But with a fever this high and her other symptoms, we need to rule out more serious conditions. She placed a reassuring hand on Jake's arm. We'll start with the basics and go from there. The next few hours were a parade of tests and worried waiting. Emily barely stirred as they drew blood, only whimpering slightly when the needle went in. Jake held her hand through everything, whispering encouragement she was too tired to acknowledge. They were moved to a proper hospital room as evening fell. Emily lay in the too-big bed, connected to monitors that beeped steadily. An IV dripped fluids and medication into her arm. Jake sat in the uncomfortable chair beside her, holding her small hand, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. The test results weren't conclusive. "We're still waiting on some cultures, Doctor," Martinez explained. "The antibiotics should help if it's bacterial, but we need to monitor her closely." Jake nodded mechanically, trying to process the medical terms being thrown at him. Words like infection and inflammation swirled in his mind, but all he could focus on was how small and vulnerable Emily looked in that hospital bed. Night settled in, bringing with it a hollow silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Jake couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's pale face, felt her burning forehead. He thought about her mother, gone too soon, and the promise he'd made to always protect their daughter. The moon cast shadows through the hospital window as Jake held vigil. Emily's fever hadn't broken despite the medications. Her breathing was shallow, and occasionally she would mumble in her sleep, lost in fever dreams. Jake's eyes burned with exhaustion and unshed tears. The weight of his helplessness pressed down on him like a physical thing. He could work 3 jobs, sell his blood, do whatever it took to keep a roof over their heads, but he couldn't fight whatever was attacking his daughter's body. The medical bills would be astronomical. Even with his new job at Thomas's company, the cost of these tests and treatments would be devastating. But Jake pushed those thoughts aside. Money didn't matter. Nothing mattered except Emily getting better. He leaned forward in his chair, still clutching Emily's hand, and pressed his forehead against the edge of her hospital bed. The sheet smelled of antiseptic and illness. His shoulders shook as he finally allowed himself to cry, quietly, so as not to wake her. "Please," he whispered to no one in particular. "Please let her be okay." The words hung in the sterile hospital air unanswered. The night stretched on endlessly. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medications. Jake remained in his chair, a sentinel against the darkness, watching his daughter fight an invisible enemy he couldn't protect her from. By dawn, Jake's world had shrunk to the size of that hospital room. His back ached from the chair. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but he didn't move. Emily's fever still raged, and the doctors still had no clear answers. The uncertainty was a knife twisting in his gut. He felt utterly alone, drowning in fear and helplessness. All his efforts to build a better life, all the progress he'd made, none of it meant anything in the face of Emily's illness. As the first rays of morning sun crept into the room, Jake faced the terrifying possibility that some things were beyond his control, beyond his ability to fix with hard work and determination. Emily stirred slightly, her face contorted in discomfort, even in sleep. Jake squeezed her hand gently, his heart breaking at how fragile she felt. In that moment, watching his daughter fight for her health, Jake had never felt more inadequate as a father. Jake paced the sterile hospital corridor, his footsteps echoing off the white walls. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and unreal. Emily's room number, 304, had been burned into his memory over the past 2 days. Her fever hadn't broken, and the doctors were still running tests. He pulled out his phone, staring at Thomas's number. His thumb hovered over the call button as pride wrestled with desperation. The hospital bills were already mounting, and his insurance wouldn't cover all the specialized tests the doctors wanted to run. A nurse emerged from Emily's room. "Mr. Wilson, your daughter's asking for you." Jake tucked the phone away and hurried inside. Emily lay in the hospital bed, looking tiny among the white sheets. Various monitors beeped steadily beside her. Her usually bright eyes were glassy with fever. "Dad?" Her voice was weak. "When can we go home?" "Soon, sweetheart." Jake pulled up a chair and took her small hand in his. "The doctors just need to figure out what's making you feel bad." Emily closed her eyes. "I'm tired of being here." "I know, baby." Jake's voice cracked. He waited until her breathing steadied into sleep before stepping out into the hallway. This time, he didn't hesitate to dial Thomas's number. "Jake?" Thomas answered on the second ring. "Is everything all right?" "No." Jake leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. "It's Emily. She's in the hospital, and they can't figure out what's wrong." "The bills." He swallowed hard. "I hate asking, but I don't know what else to do." "Which hospital?" Thomas's voice was sharp with concern. "Memorial General, room 304. I'll be there in 20 minutes." True to his word, Thomas arrived exactly 20 minutes later, wearing an expensive suit that made him stand out among the practical scrubs and worn clothing of other visitors. He carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression of genuine concern. "How is she?" he asked, approaching Jake. "Sleeping now. The fever won't break, and they're talking about more tests." Jake ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I can't afford—" Thomas held up a hand. "Let me speak with her doctors." Jake watched as Thomas disappeared down the hallway, his confident stride a stark contrast to Jake's own uncertainty. He returned to Emily's room, taking up his vigil in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed. An hour later, Thomas entered quietly. Emily was still sleeping, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. "Step outside with me," Thomas said softly. In the hallway, Thomas opened his briefcase and pulled out several documents. "I've arranged everything. The hospital bills will be taken care of." Jake's throat tightened. "Thomas, I can't." "You can, and you will." Thomas's voice was firm but kind. "But there's more. Our company has been developing new treatment protocols. We have access to advanced diagnostic tools that could help determine what's wrong with Emily." Jake stiffened. "What kind of treatment protocols?" "Nothing experimental," Thomas assured him quickly. "Everything is FDA approved. We simply have better equipment, better facilities. The kind of care most people can't access." Jake looked through the doorway at his sleeping daughter. "And the cost?" "Covered by the company." Thomas placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Consider it part of your employee benefits package." The weight of the offer pressed down on Jake. He thought of all the questions he still had about Thomas's company, all the uncertainty about what they really did with the blood samples. But when he looked at Emily's pale face, none of that seemed to matter. "Okay," he said finally. "What do we need to do?" Thomas pulled out more papers. "I'll have her transferred to our private medical facility this afternoon. The paperwork's already prepared." Jake took the documents with trembling hands. As he signed each page, he felt both relief and unease washing over him. Thomas's efficiency was both comforting and slightly unsettling. "Thank you," Jake said, handing back the signed forms. "I don't know how I'll ever repay." "You don't have to." Thomas tucked the papers away. "Just focus on Emily getting better." They walked back into Emily's room together. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Jake noticed how Thomas's expression softened as he looked at her. "The transfer team will be here in a few hours," Thomas said quietly. "Our facility is only 15 minutes away. You'll have unlimited access, of course." Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "And Jake?" Thomas turned to him. "She's going to be okay, I promise." As they left Thomas's office later that day, after signing the final paperwork for Emily's transfer, Jake felt a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. He'd never been so dependent on another person before, never had to swallow his pride quite so completely. But as Thomas held the door open for him, Jake realized that sometimes accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was an act of love for his daughter. "The transfer team should be at the hospital now," Thomas said as they walked to the elevator. "Everything's going to be fine, Jake. Emily will be in the best hands possible." Jake nodded, holding on to those words like a lifeline. Whatever doubts he had about Thomas and his company would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was getting Emily the help she needed. Jake stood by Emily's hospital bed, watching as the nurse adjusted the IV drip. The clear liquid flowing into his daughter's arm was supposedly the special treatment Thomas had arranged. Emily slept peacefully, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, her fever finally starting to break. "Mr. Walker?" A soft voice called from the doorway. Dr. Sarah Chin, one of Thomas's research physicians, stood there with a tablet in her hands. "Could we talk for a moment? Outside?" Jake bent down to kiss Emily's forehead, then followed Dr. Chin into the hallway. The corridor was quiet, except for the distant beeping of monitors and the squeak of nurses' shoes on the linoleum floor. "Emily's responding well to the treatment," Dr. Chin said, swiping through charts on her tablet. "Her vitals are stabilizing, and the fever's coming down." "That's good news." Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "What exactly is this treatment?" Thomas wasn't very specific about it. Dr. Chin hesitated, glancing around the empty hallway. "Mr. Walker, I think there's something you should see." She handed him the tablet, showing him what looked like a complex medical document. "This is the research protocol for the treatment Emily's receiving. It's part of a larger study Thomas has been conducting." Jake's eyes scanned the document, his confusion growing with each line. Words jumped out at him. Genetic markers, hereditary stress responses, targeted cellular modification. "I don't understand," he said, his throat tightening. What is all this? Dr. Chin lowered her voice. Thomas has been collecting blood samples from people in difficult situations, single parents, specifically. He's been studying how stress and hardship affect genetic expression, looking for ways to enhance human resilience. Jake's hand trembled as he held the tablet. What do you mean enhance? The treatment Emily's receiving? It's derived from research on blood samples like yours. Thomas believes he's found a way to modify genetic responses to stress, to make people stronger, more adaptable. She paused, watching Jake's face carefully. You weren't just selected for blood donation, Mr. Walker. You were chosen as a research subject. The world seemed to tilt beneath Jake's feet. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady himself. All those blood draws, all those tests, they weren't just about money or helping others. He'd been part of an experiment. Does Thomas have the right to do this? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. Legally, the consent forms you signed were comprehensive. Ethically, Doctor? Chin shook her head. That's more complicated. Thomas believes he's working towards something revolutionary, a way to help people overcome their circumstances on a genetic level. Jake thought about all the times Thomas had seemed genuinely concerned about his welfare, all the conversations they'd shared. Had it all been an act? Just a way to keep his test subject cooperative? He handed the tablet back to Dr. Chin, his movements mechanical. Thank you for telling me this. Mr. Walker, I know this is a lot to process, but the treatment is helping Emily. Whatever Thomas's methods, his research is producing results. Jake nodded numbly, but her words felt distant, meaningless. He walked back into Emily's room, sinking into the chair beside her bed. His daughter slept on, unaware of the turmoil in her father's heart. Hours passed. Jake sat there, watching Emily's peaceful face, his mind churning with everything he'd learned. Each time a nurse came to check Emily's vitals, he wondered if they knew the truth about the treatment, about Thomas's real work. As evening approached, Jake heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his usual confident smile in place. Jake, Thomas said warmly, I heard Emily's responding well to the treatment. I thought I'd stop by and... Don't. Jake's voice was ice cold. He stood up slowly, careful not to disturb Emily. Let's talk outside. In the hallway, Jake turned to face Thomas. The businessman's smile had faded, replaced by a wary expression. You know, don't you? Thomas asked quietly. About your research? About how you've been using people like me as lab rats? Jake's hands clenched into fists. Yeah, I know. Thomas straightened his shoulders. Everything I've done has been to help people, Jake. To find ways to make humanity stronger, more resilient. Look at Emily. The treatment is working. That's not the point. Jake's voice rose, and he forced himself to lower it again. You lied to me. You manipulated me. All that talk about wanting to help, about understanding what I was going through, was any of it real? Of course it was real, Thomas insisted. I chose you because I saw someone who deserved better, someone who could benefit from my work. Everything I told you about my past, about building something meaningful, it was all true. Jake shook his head, feeling something break inside him. You don't get it, do you? You can't just experiment on people because you think you know what's best for them. We're not your personal science project. Jake, please? No. Jake held up his hand. I'm grateful that Emily's getting better, but after she's well, he met Thomas's eyes. I don't want anything more to do with you or your company. The hurt that flashed across Thomas's face almost made Jake waver. Almost. But then he remembered all the secrets, all the lies by omission, and his resolve hardened. I'll finish out the month at work, Jake said. That's it. After that, we're done. He turned and walked back into Emily's room, closing the door behind him. Through the window, he could see Thomas standing in the hallway, looking lost and alone. Jake turned away, focusing on his daughter's sleeping face. The betrayal sat heavy in his chest, a cold weight that seemed to grow with each breath. He'd trusted Thomas, had even started to see him as a friend. Now all of that was tainted, twisted by the truth of what had really been happening. Emily stirred in her sleep, and Jake reached out to smooth her hair. At least she was getting better. That was what mattered most. But as he sat there in the gathering darkness, Jake knew that something fundamental had changed. The hope and security he'd felt in recent weeks had been built on lies, and now it was crumbling away, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. Jake's footsteps echoed through the sterile hallway of Thomas's research facility. His hands were clenched into fists, a manila folder clutched tightly in his right hand. The pristine walls that once represented hope now felt cold and clinical. His heart pounded against his chest as he approached Thomas's office. Without knocking, Jake pushed open the heavy oak door. Thomas sat behind his desk, typing away at his computer. He looked up, his usual composed expression faltering slightly at Jake's unexpected entrance. "Jake? I wasn't expecting you today. How's Emily doing?" Thomas's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Jake had never noticed before. Jake slammed the folder onto Thomas's desk, spreading papers across the polished surface. Test results, genetic markers, and clinical trial data scattered before them. "What is all this, Thomas? And don't give me any of your usual vague answers." Thomas carefully gathered the papers, his movements deliberate and measured. He adjusted his tie and leaned back in his chair. "Where did you get these? Does it matter?" Jake's voice cracked with emotion. "I trusted you. I brought my daughter here for treatment. And all this time, you've been—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas stood up slowly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. "It's not what you think, Jake. Yes, we've been conducting tests on the blood samples, but it's for something bigger than you can imagine. Try me." Jake spat out the words. Thomas turned to face him. "We're working on ways to improve human genetics, to eliminate diseases before they start, to make people stronger, healthier, better equipped to handle the challenges of life." He paused, his eyes meeting Jake's. "Think about Emily. Think about all the children who won't have to suffer through illness if we succeed." Jake's anger wavered slightly, but he held firm. "So you used me? Used all those desperate people who came to sell their blood?" "I helped you," Thomas countered. "You were drowning in debt, working yourself to death. Now you have a stable job, a future. Emily is getting the best medical care available, but you never told me the truth." Jake's voice rose. "You let me think this was just about blood donation, about medical research, not about whatever this is." He gestured at the papers. Thomas walked back to his desk, his shoulders tense. "Would you have agreed if I had told you everything from the start?" "Sometimes, Jake, the end justifies the means." "That's not your decision to make," Jake said, his voice quieter now but filled with disappointment. "These are people's lives you're playing with. My life. My daughter's life." Thomas sat down heavily in his chair. For the first time since Jake had known him, he looked tired. "Everything I've done has been to help people, to prevent others from suffering like I did growing up, like you're suffering now." Jake shook his head, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "I get wanting to help people, Thomas. I do, but this?" He picked up one of the papers. "Testing people without their knowledge? Using their desperation to further your research? That's not help. That's exploitation." Silence filled the room. Thomas's usual confident demeanor cracked slightly. "The treatment Emily is receiving, it's working, isn't it?" Jake felt the weight of those words. Emily was getting better. Her fever had broken. Her strength was returning. But at what cost? "Yes," he admitted reluctantly. "It's working." "Then perhaps you can understand why I do what I do," Thomas said softly. "Sometimes the path to helping others isn't as straightforward as we'd like it to be." Jake stood there, feeling the conflict tear at his heart. The man before him had saved his daughter's life, had pulled him from the brink of financial ruin, but he'd also used him, used countless others, for his own agenda. "I need time," Jake finally said, his voice hollow. I can't process all of this right now." Thomas nodded slowly. "Take whatever time you need. Your position will be here waiting." Jake turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The treatment for Emily will continue," Thomas assured him. "Whatever you decide, that won't change." Jake nodded once, then walked out of the office. The hallway seemed longer than ever before, each step heavy with the weight of his conflicting emotions. He thought about Emily, about the smile returning to her face as she grew stronger. He thought about Thomas, the man who'd given him hope when he had none, but who'd also kept such significant secrets. As he pushed through the building's main doors into the cool afternoon air, Jake felt lost. The security of the past few months seemed to crumble around him. He pulled out his phone and called Emily's nurse, making sure his daughter was okay. After hanging up, he sat on a nearby bench, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk. Each person who walked by could have been like him, desperate, struggling, unknowingly part of Thomas's grand experiment. The thought made his stomach turn, but then he thought of Emily, of the miracle of her recovery, of the possibility that Thomas's research could help other children avoid suffering. Jake pulled out his keys, the new car key Thomas had given him catching the sunlight. Everything he owned now, everything that had given him hope for the future, was tied to this place, to Thomas. He couldn't just walk away. But he couldn't pretend nothing had changed either. As he walked to his car, Jake knew he needed space to think, to sort through the tangled mess of gratitude and betrayal that clouded his mind. He would take a break, focus on Emily's recovery, and try to figure out where to go from here. But for now, the weight of the truth sat heavy on his shoulders, and he had no idea how to carry it. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Jake sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching Emily's chest rise and fall with each labored breath. Her small frame looked even tinier beneath the white hospital sheets, her skin pale against the sterile surroundings. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her usual bright smile was replaced by a grimace of discomfort. "Daddy?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "My head really hurts." Jake leaned forward, gently brushing her damp hair from her forehead. "I know, sweetie. Try to rest, okay?" His voice cracked slightly, but he forced a smile. Emily's fever had spiked again, and the doctor seemed puzzled by her worsening condition. A nurse entered the room, checking Emily's vitals with practiced efficiency. Jake watched her face carefully, searching for any sign of concern. She made notes on her tablet, her expression neutral. "How is she?" Jake asked, standing up. The nurse gave him a sympathetic look. "Her fever's still high, Mr. Walker. The doctor will be in shortly to discuss the latest test results." After she left, Jake paced the small room, his mind racing. The medical bills were already mounting, and Emily's regular treatment wasn't working anymore. He'd been avoiding Thomas's calls for days, still angry about the revelation of the secret testing program. But now, watching his daughter struggle, Jake wondered if his pride was worth the risk. The doctor arrived an hour later, clipboard in hand. Dr. Martinez was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who had been treating Emily since her admission. "Mr. Walker, could we step outside for a moment?" Jake's stomach dropped. He squeezed Emily's hand. "I'll be right back, sweetheart." In the hallway, Dr. Martinez's expression was grave. "Emily's condition is deteriorating faster than we expected. The infection is resistant to our standard treatments, and her immune system isn't responding as it should." Jake leaned against the wall for support. "What are our options?" "There are some experimental treatments available," she said carefully. "But they're costly, and most insurance companies won't cover them. We can try another round of antibiotics, but I have to be honest. I'm concerned about her recovery without more aggressive intervention." Jake's vision blurred with tears. He thought about the folder he'd thrown on Thomas's desk, filled with research about groundbreaking medical treatments that could help Emily. Back in the room, Emily had fallen into a fitful sleep. Jake watched her toss and turn, his heart breaking. The monitor showed her temperature climbing again. 103.2, 103.5, 103.8. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as panic began to set in. A young nurse rushed in with ice packs, placing them strategically around Emily's body. "We need to bring this fever down," she muttered, more to herself than to Jake. Emily's eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whimpered. "I'm right here, baby." Jake held her small hand, feeling utterly helpless. Her skin burned against his palm. The next few hours were a blur of medical staff coming and going, each wearing increasingly worried expressions. Emily's fever refused to break, and her breathing became more labored. Jake felt like he was drowning, watching his daughter slip away while he stood by, powerless. At midnight, Emily's temperature hit 104.2. The room suddenly filled with medical staff, their voices urgent but controlled. Jake was ushered to the corner as they worked, adding new medications to her IV, checking and rechecking her vitals. "Mr. Walker?" Dr. Martinez pulled him aside. "We need to move Emily to intensive care. Her condition is critical." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He watched as they prepared to transfer his daughter, his hand shaking. Everything he'd been angry about, Thomas's secret testing, the betrayal of trust, the manipulation, seemed trivial now. None of it mattered compared to Emily's life. In the ICU, the beeping of monitors seemed louder, more insistent. Emily looked even smaller, surrounded by the additional medical equipment. Jake sat beside her bed, holding her hand, feeling more alone than he had since his wife's death. "Daddy?" Emily's voice was weak. "Can you tell me about Mom?" Jake's throat tightened. "Of course, sweetie. Your mom. She was the bravest person I ever knew, just like you are." Emily managed a tiny smile before drifting back to sleep. Jake watched her temperature continue to climb. 104.5 now. The nurses exchanged worried glances as they checked her vitals. At 2 a.m., Dr. Martinez returned with more bad news. The new antibiotics aren't working. We need to consider every possible option now, Mr. Walker. Every hour counts. Jake nodded numbly, his mind already made up. He stepped into the hallway, pulled out his phone, and stared at Thomas's number. His thumb hovered over the screen as pride wrestled with desperation. Emily's monitor alarm sounded from inside the room, making the decision for him. Jake hit the call button, his hand trembling. Thomas answered on the first ring. "Jake? Thomas." Jake's voice broke. "I need your help. It's Emily. She's really sick and nothing's working. I know I said some things, and I'm still not sure about everything, but..." He had to stop, choking back a sob. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Thomas spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Which hospital?" Jake leaned against the wall, relief and fear warring in his chest. "Memorial. She's in the ICU. I'm on my way." "And Jake?" Thomas paused. "We're going to help her, I promise." The call ended, and Jake slid down the wall, his face in his hands. He didn't know if he could trust Thomas, didn't know if he was making the right choice, but as another alarm sounded from Emily's room, he knew one thing for certain. He had no other choice left to make. Thomas burst through the hospital doors, his usual composed demeanor replaced by genuine concern. Behind him, a team of doctors in pristine white coats followed with purposeful strides. Jake looked up from Emily's bedside, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and worry. "Jake," Thomas said softly, approaching the bed. "I brought the best specialists I know." Jake's throat tightened. He glanced at his daughter's pale face, then back at Thomas. The machines continued their steady beeping, a reminder of how serious things had become. "I don't know if I can," Jake started, his voice cracking. "Please," Thomas interrupted. "Let me help. No strings attached." His eyes held a warmth Jake had never seen before. "These doctors are from my research facility. They understand Emily's condition better than anyone else." Jake ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, conflict evident on his face. The weight of his pride battled against his daughter's needs. Emily stirred in her sleep, her small hand clutching the blanket. "All the medical bills," Thomas continued quietly. "Everything she needs. I'll take care of it." A nurse entered the room, checking Emily's vitals. The specialist huddled near the door, speaking in hushed tones as they reviewed her charts. Jake watched them, feeling overwhelmed by their presence. "Why?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything that happened, why would you still want to help us?" Thomas pulled up a chair next to Jake. For a moment, he just sat there, watching Emily's peaceful face, because sometimes doing the right thing isn't about business or research or proving a point. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's about being human." Jake's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." Thomas squeezed Jake's shoulder and stood up, gesturing for the specialist to approach. They moved forward efficiently, introducing themselves to Jake one by one. As they began their examination of Emily, Thomas remained by Jake's side, a steady presence in the chaos. Hours passed. The specialist worked methodically, ordering new tests and adjusting Emily's treatment plan. Thomas never left the room, making calls when necessary but always returning to his spot near Jake. He brought coffee, insisted Jake eat something, and listened when Jake needed to talk. As evening approached, Emily's color began to improve. The head specialist, Dr. Chin, explained the new treatment protocol they'd developed. Jake listened, understanding little of the medical terminology but grateful for the hope in the doctor's voice. "The treatment is experimental," Dr. Chin admitted, "but based on our research, we believe it will help Emily recover fully." Jake looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "It's safe," Thomas assured him. "We've tested it extensively. I wouldn't suggest it otherwise." Emily stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. "Daddy?" she called weakly. Jake was at her side in an instant, holding her hand. "I'm here, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she mumbled, then noticed Thomas standing nearby. "Hi, Mr. Thomas." Thomas stepped closer, his usually stern face softening into a gentle smile. "Hello, Emily. We're going to help you feel better, okay?" She nodded, her eyes already growing heavy again. Before drifting off, she squeezed her father's hand and whispered, "Don't be sad, Daddy." Jake's eyes welled up with tears. He felt Thomas's hand on his shoulder again, offering silent support. The gesture, simple as it was, meant more than any words could express. As night fell, the specialist left, promising to return in the morning. The regular hospital staff continued their rounds, checking on Emily periodically. Thomas insisted on staying, setting up his laptop in a corner of the room to handle any urgent business matters. You don't have to stay, Jake said, watching Thomas work from his uncomfortable chair. Thomas looked up from his screen. I know I don't have to. I want to. The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of distrust he'd been carrying. Thank you, Jake said quietly. Not just for the money or the doctors, for being here. Thomas closed his laptop and moved his chair closer to Jake's. You know, when I first started my company, it was all about the research, the breakthrough, the next big discovery. He glanced at Emily's sleeping form. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what it was really about. Helping people, making a difference in their lives. Jake listened, hearing the honesty in Thomas's voice. The man beside him wasn't the cold, calculating businessman he'd first met at the blood bank. This was someone who genuinely cared, who had perhaps been as lonely and lost as Jake had been. I'm sorry I doubted your intentions, Jake said. I was scared and angry, and it was easier to push you away than to trust you. You had every right to be cautious, Thomas replied. I wasn't always clear about my motives. But Jake, I hope you know now that I consider you and Emily more than just test subjects or employees. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Your family. The words settled between them, warm and unexpected. Jake looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and saw the same loneliness he'd been carrying since losing his wife. They were two broken people who had somehow found their way to each other through circumstances neither could have predicted. Emily's monitors beeped steadily in the background, a rhythm that was becoming more stable with each passing hour. The new treatment was already showing positive signs, just as Dr. Chin had predicted. Family? Jake repeated softly, testing the word. It felt right, despite everything that had happened between them. I think I'd like that. Thomas smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching over Emily as she slept peacefully, her breathing stronger than it had been in days. The night stretched on, but neither man moved from their vigil. They had crossed a boundary, moved from suspicion to trust, from distance to closeness. In the sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines and uncertainty, they had found something neither expected: true friendship. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across Emily's bed. Jake blinked awake from his uncomfortable position in the chair, his neck stiff from another night of watching over his daughter. But today was different. For the first time in days, Emily's cheeks had a hint of color. Daddy? Emily's voice was stronger than it had been all week. She pushed herself up against the pillows, her eyes clearer and more alert. Jake leaned forward, his heart leaping. Hey, sweetheart, how are you feeling? Better. She smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. My head doesn't hurt anymore. Thomas, who had been quietly reading reports in the corner, set down his papers and approached the bed. He'd been there every day, arriving early and leaving late, coordinating with the medical team and ensuring Emily received the best care possible. That's wonderful news, Emily, Thomas said, his usually stern face softening. The doctor said your latest test results are very promising. Jake watched as Emily gave Thomas a small wave. It was the first time she'd acknowledged him directly since he'd brought in his medical team. The gesture, though simple, spoke volumes about how far they'd come. A nurse entered with breakfast. Real food this time, not just clear liquids. Emily's eyes lit up at the sight of pancakes, and Jake felt tears prick at his corners of his eyes. He quickly wiped them away before anyone could notice. The treatment is working exactly as we hoped, Thomas explained quietly to Jake while Emily ate. The specialized antibodies we developed are targeting the infection without causing the usual side effects. She should be able to go home in a few days. Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The past week had been a blur of fear and uncertainty, but Thomas had been there through all of it, not just as a benefactor signing checks, but as someone who genuinely seemed to care. Later that afternoon, while Emily napped, Jake found himself in the hospital's small courtyard with Thomas. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched under their feet as they walked. I don't know how to thank you, Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence. What you've done for Emily. Thomas shook his head. You don't need to thank me. This is why I do what I do, Jake. The research, the testing. It's all about helping people like Emily. Jake stopped walking, studying the man beside him. Gone was the mysterious businessman who had first approached him at the blood bank. In his place was someone who looked tired but satisfied, his usual polish slightly rumpled from days spent at the hospital. I misjudged you, Jake admitted. When I found out about the testing, I thought you were just using people, using me. Thomas leaned against a wooden bench, his expression thoughtful. I understand why you felt that way. My methods aren't always conventional, and I'm not always good at explaining my intentions. But everything I do at the company, every test, every treatment we develop, it's about making a real difference." A doctor approached them with Emily's latest test results, and Jake watched as Thomas immediately focused on the details, asking questions and suggesting adjustments to her treatment plan. His dedication was obvious in every interaction, every decision. Back in Emily's room, Jake observed as Thomas sat with his daughter, helping her with a puzzle book one of the nurses had brought. Thomas pointed at something on the page, and Emily giggled, an actual laugh, the kind Jake hadn't heard since before she got sick. "Look, Daddy," Emily called out. "Thomas showed me how to solve the riddle." Jake moved closer, seeing the completed word, puzzle. Thomas had drawn little hints in the margins, turning the exercise into a game that had clearly captured Emily's interest. "That's great, sweetheart," Jake said, his voice warm. He caught Thomas's eye, seeing not the wealthy research company owner, but someone who had become something more, a friend who had stood by them when they needed it most. The afternoon passed peacefully. Emily's doctor came by for another checkup, confirming what they could all see. She was getting better. The specialized treatment was working exactly as Thomas had promised it would. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital room, Jake watched Thomas gathering his things to leave for the day. The man paused by Emily's bed, where she had fallen asleep surrounded by puzzle books and crayons. "Same time tomorrow?" Thomas asked quietly, adjusting Emily's blanket with a gentleness that spoke of genuine care. Jake nodded, feeling a profound shift in his understanding of the man before him. Thomas wasn't just a businessman with deep pockets and questionable methods. He was someone trying to make the world better, one person at a time. Looking at his sleeping daughter's peaceful face, Jake realized that Thomas's help hadn't come with the hidden agenda he'd feared. The man had given them not just medical care and financial support, but hope. Hope that had been in short supply in Jake's life for far too long. As Thomas headed for the door, Jake called out softly, "Thomas?" The other man turned, eyebrows raised in question. "Thank you," Jake said simply, meaning it more than he ever had before. "For everything." Thomas's usual professional mask softened into a genuine smile. "Get some rest, Jake. I'll see you both tomorrow." Watching Thomas leave, Jake settled back into his chair beside Emily's bed. His daughter's steady breathing filled the quiet room, and for the first time in days, he felt truly at peace. The man he'd once viewed with suspicion had become someone he trusted completely, someone who had proved that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Emily stirred in her sleep, a small smile on her face. Jake reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth that had returned to her fingers. Thanks to Thomas's intervention, his daughter was getting better. And somehow, along the way, Jake had found not just a benefactor, but someone who genuinely cared about making a difference in their lives. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across Emily's sleeping form. Jake watched his daughter's chest rise and fall with steady breaths, a sight that filled him with profound relief. The color had returned to her cheeks, and the doctors were optimistic about her recovery. In the quiet of the hospital room, memories of the past few years washed over Jake. He remembered the day his wife Sarah died, how the world had seemed to stop spinning, leaving him alone with an inconsolable 5-year-old daughter. The weight of that loss had nearly crushed him, but somehow he'd found the strength to keep going. Jake rubbed his tired eyes, thinking about all the nights he'd worked multiple jobs, the times he'd sold his blood just to make rent. The shame of not being able to provide for Emily had eaten away at him, making him feel like he was failing Sarah's memory. He'd been so focused on survival that he hadn't allowed himself to properly grieve. Emily stirred in her sleep, mumbling something that sounded like "Mommy." Jake's heart clenched, but the pain wasn't as sharp as it used to be. He reached out and gently smoothed her hair, remembering how Sarah used to do the same thing when Emily was a baby. "Your mom would be so proud of how brave you've been," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said you were the strongest person she knew, even when you were tiny." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Jake look up. Through the glass wall of Emily's room, he could see Thomas talking with one of the doctors, his usual composed demeanor somehow softer in the morning light. The sight of him stirred complicated feelings in Jake's chest, gratitude mixed with lingering uncertainty. Jake thought back to his initial suspicion of Thomas, the anger he'd felt upon discovering the true nature of the blood tests. But now, watching Emily recover thanks to the treatment Thomas had provided, Jake couldn't deny that the man's intentions, however unclear at first, had ultimately saved his daughter's life. A nurse came in to check Emily's vitals, offering Jake a warm smile. "Her numbers are looking much better today," she said quietly. "The new treatment is working wonderfully." After she left, Jake stood up and walked to the window, stretching his stiff muscles. The city sprawled out below, already bustling with morning traffic. Somewhere out there was his old apartment, probably rented to someone else by now. He'd moved into a better place last month, thanks to his new job at Thomas's company. Emily had her own room now, decorated with the butterfly wallpaper she'd always wanted. The thought brought unexpected tears to his eyes. For so long, he'd been trapped in a cycle of barely getting by, of constant worry and exhaustion. He'd been so afraid of accepting help, of trusting anyone else, that he'd almost missed the opportunity for a better life when it appeared. Sarah's voice seemed to echo in his memory. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone else help you carry the load." She'd always been wise that way, seeing through his stubborn pride to the heart of things. Jake touched the window, his reflection overlapping with the city view. He looked different now, less haunted, despite the current stress of Emily's illness. The dark circles under his eyes weren't quite so pronounced, and his shoulders didn't carry the same desperate tension they had for years. Emily made a small sound, and Jake turned back to her bed. Her eyes fluttered open, clearer than they'd been in days. "Hi, Daddy," she said softly. "Hey, sweetheart." Jake sat on the edge of her bed, taking her small hand in his. "How are you feeling?" "Better." She looked past him to the window. "Can we go home soon?" "Soon," Jake promised, his heart full. "The doctors say you're getting stronger every day." Thomas appeared in the doorway, knocking gently on the frame. "May I come in?" Jake nodded, noticing how Emily's face brightened at the sight of Thomas. She'd grown fond of him over the past few weeks, especially after he'd brought her a stuffed penguin that hadn't left her side since. "Good morning, Emily," Thomas said, his usual businesslike manner softening as it always did around her. "I hear you're feeling better today." "Mr. Thomas," Emily hugged her penguin closer. "Did you bring any more books?" Thomas produced a colorful storybook from behind his back, and Emily's face lit up with delight. As he sat down to read to her, Jake felt something shift inside him, a letting go of old pain, a acceptance of new possibilities. He watched Thomas reading animatedly to Emily, doing different voices for each character, and realized that somewhere along the way, this man had become more than just his employer or benefactor. Despite all the complications and misunderstandings, Thomas had proven himself to be someone Jake could trust, someone who genuinely cared about both him and Emily. The morning sun continued to fill the room with warm light, and Jake felt the last of his defensive walls beginning to crumble. He thought of Sarah again, but this time, the memory brought a gentle warmth instead of crushing pain. She would have wanted this for them, not just survival, but the chance to truly live again, to find happiness and security, to let new people into their lives. Jake looked at his daughter, giggling at Thomas's silly character voices, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. They weren't alone anymore. They had help, they had opportunities, and most importantly, they had hope. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jake felt ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jake's new office as he settled into his leather chair. The nameplate on his desk read, "Jake Harrison, Senior Operations Manager," a title that still felt surreal whenever he looked at it. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the city sprawling below, a view that reminded him daily of how far he'd come. His desk phone buzzed. "Mr. Harrison," his assistant's voice came through clearly. "The research team is ready for your review meeting." "Thanks, Sarah," he replied, gathering his papers. The name still caught in his throat sometimes. He'd hired her knowing they shared his late wife's name, perhaps as a way of facing his past head-on. In the conference room, 6 eager faces looked up at him. These were some of the brightest minds in medical research, and now they reported to him. Jake took his place at the head of the table, spreading out the quarterly reports. "All right, team," he said, his voice steady and confident. "Walk me through the latest trial results." As they presented their findings, Jake found himself fully engaged, asking pointed questions and offering insights. The nervous father who'd once sold his blood just to make rent was gone, replaced by someone who understood the intricacies of medical research and could guide others through complex decisions. During a brief break, Thomas stopped by, leaning against the doorframe with an approving smile. "How's it going in here?" "We're making progress," Jake replied, standing to greet his mentor and friend. "The new treatment protocol is showing promising results." Thomas nodded, his eyes twinkling with pride. "I knew you'd excel at this, Jake. You've got a natural talent for leadership." Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest at the praise. It wasn't just about the words. It was about knowing he'd earned them. Every late night studying medical journals, every extra hour spent understanding the research, every difficult decision he'd made had led to this moment. After the meeting, Jake walked through the research facility, checking in with various departments. Lab technicians greeted him with respect, and he knew each of their names, their stories. He'd been in their shoes not so long ago, and he made sure never to forget that. In his office later that afternoon, Jake reviewed personnel files for a new project team he was assembling. His phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Dad, don't forget, dinner tonight. Just us two." Jake smiled, typing back a quick response. He glanced at the family photo on his desk, him and Emily at her recent school science fair, where she'd won first place. His daughter was thriving now, healthy and happy. Her earlier illness just a memory. Before leaving the office, Jake stopped by the blood donation center where it had all started. The familiar smell of antiseptic brought back memories of desperation, of counting every dollar, of wondering how he'd keep a roof over their heads. Now he oversaw this facility, ensuring others in need got the same chance he'd been given. A young single mother was there, looking as scared and desperate as he once had. Jake approached her gently. "First time here?" She nodded, clutching her purse. I need the money for my son's school supplies." Jake pulled up a chair beside her. "What's your name?" "Maria," she replied softly. "Maria, I want you to know something. This place, it's more than just a blood bank. We're developing treatments that save lives. And we believe in helping people get back on their feet." He handed her his business card. "Come see me tomorrow. We might have a position that would suit you." The gratitude in her eyes reminded him of his own journey. As he walked to his car, Jake felt a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was helping others find their way out of darkness. At home, Jake changed out of his suit and started preparing dinner. Emily sat at the kitchen counter, working on her homework while chattering about her day. The kitchen was bright and clean, filled with the smell of cooking pasta, a far cry from the cramped, cluttered space where they'd once shared meager meals. "Dad," Emily said, looking up from her textbook, "Mrs. Johnson asked us to write about our hero today." Jake stirred the sauce, listening. "Oh yeah? Who did you write about?" "You," she said simply. "I wrote about how you never gave up, even when things were really hard." Jake had to turn away for a moment, his eyes misting over. When he'd composed himself, he served their dinner, a proper meal with fresh ingredients, not the budget meals of their past. As they sat together at their small dining table, Jake looked at his daughter, now 12, growing more beautiful and brilliant every day. She looked so much like her mother, but she had his determination, his resilience. "Emily," he said, reaching across to take her hand, "I want you to know something." She looked up, fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Everything I've done, everything I'm still doing, it's all for you. When your mom died, I was so scared I wouldn't be enough. But you gave me the strength to keep going. You're the reason I get up every morning, the reason I keep fighting to make things better." Emily squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "I know, Dad, and you're doing great. I love you so much, kiddo," Jake continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise you, I'm going to keep fighting for our future every single day." "I love you too, Dad," Emily replied, getting up to give him a hug. "And I'm really proud of you." They sat there in their warm kitchen, sharing a meal and sharing their love, both knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Jake stared at the pristine white walls of his corner office, so different from the cramped apartment kitchen where he used to sort through overdue bills. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor as he paced, trying to shake off the unease that had been growing inside him. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he watched workers in white lab coats moving through the facility below. They reminded him of his first days here, desperate and selling his blood just to make rent. Now he supervised those same labs, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. His phone buzzed. Another message from Thomas about the upcoming board meeting. Jake's stomach tightened as he thought about the presentation he needed to give, explaining how they'd expand their testing program to more clinics, reaching more desperate people just like he had been. "Mr. Harrison?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The research team is ready for your review." Jake straightened his tie, a silk one Thomas had given him for his promotion. "Send them in." 3 scientists entered, carrying tablets and thick folders. They spread their materials across his sleek conference table, talking excitedly about their latest breakthrough. Jake nodded along, but their words began to blur together as a familiar feeling of disconnect washed over him. "The results are promising," one scientist said, pointing to a graph. "With the new testing protocol, we can identify potential candidates much faster." "Candidates," Jake repeated softly. The word felt wrong in his mouth. These were people, parents, maybe single fathers, like he had been, selling their blood to keep their families afloat. "Is everything all right, Mr. Harrison?" the youngest scientist asked, noticing his distraction. Jake forced a smile. "Just thinking through the implications. Please continue." But as they talked about efficiency rates and success metrics, Jake's mind wandered to Emily. She was thriving now, attending a private school Thomas had recommended. Her health had improved dramatically after the treatment, and she smiled more than ever. Yet something about it all felt hollow. After the meeting, Jake closed his office door and loosened his tie. He caught his reflection in the window: designer suit, perfectly trimmed hair, expensive watch. A far cry from the man who used to work 3 jobs just to survive. "What would Sarah think?" he whispered, thinking of his late wife. Would she recognize the man he'd become? Would she be proud of his success or ashamed of how he'd achieved it? His phone buzzed again. Thomas wanted to see him. Walking through the pristine corridors to Thomas's executive suite, Jake passed more labs, more testing rooms. Behind each window, he saw himself from months ago. Desperate people hoping for a better life, not knowing they were part of something bigger, something that still made Jake's conscience ache. Thomas's office dwarfed Jake's. The older man stood at his desk, reviewing documents on multiple screens. "Jake?" he said warmly. "How did the research review go?" "Fine," Jake said automatically, then stopped. The weight of everything, the guilt, the confusion, the moral ambiguity, suddenly felt crushing. "Actually, no, it's not fine." Thomas looked up, his expression concerned. "What's wrong?" "Everything," Jake's voice cracked. "The testing program, the way we find people, what we're doing with their blood, it's all wrong. We're taking advantage of desperate people, just like I was. And now I'm helping you do it." His legs felt weak. Jake sank into one of Thomas's leather chairs, putting his head in his hands. "I used to be someone my daughter could look up to. Someone Sarah would have been proud of. Now I don't even know anymore." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then Jake heard footsteps and felt a hand on his shoulder. "Look at me, Jake." Jake raised his head. Thomas's usually composed face showed genuine emotion. "What do you think we're really doing here?" Thomas asked softly. "Yes, we find people in difficult situations. Yes, we test their blood. But what happens to them afterward?" "They get money," Jake said bitterly. "Like I did." "They get hope," Thomas corrected. "They get opportunities. Look at yourself. You're not just surviving anymore. You're thriving. Your daughter is healthy and happy. You're making a difference in people's lives. By exploiting them, by giving them a chance, the same chance you got." Thomas sat down across from Jake. "Every person who comes through our program gets offered real employment, healthcare, education opportunities for their children. We're not just taking their blood, we're investing in their futures." Jake's throat felt tight. "But the testing is helping us develop treatments that will save lives, like the one that saved Emily." Thomas leaned forward. "You're not the man you used to be, Jake, and that's not a bad thing. You've grown, you've learned. You're in a position to help others now, just as you were helped." The tears Jake had been holding back finally spilled over. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried, probably not since Sarah's funeral. All the pressure, the guilt, the fear came pouring out. Thomas didn't speak. He simply sat there, a steady presence as Jake's shoulders shook with silent sobs. When Jake finally looked up, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, Thomas handed him a handkerchief. "Your path isn't defined by your past mistakes or current doubts," Thomas said quietly. "It's defined by your will to change, to grow, to help others. That's why I chose you, Jake. Not because you were desperate, but because I saw in you the potential to understand both sides of this work, the hard choices and the hope they can bring." Jake sat at his desk, staring at the stack of applications before him. Each one represented someone like him, struggling parents, desperate for a chance. His fingers traced the edges of the papers, remembering how it felt to be on the other side of hope. "Dad?" Emily's voice came from the doorway. She looked healthy now, her cheeks rosy and full. "Are you coming to lunch?" "Just a minute, sweetheart." Jake smiled, watching his daughter settle into one of the leather chairs across from his desk. She'd grown taller in the past few months, and her recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. I'm reviewing some applications for the new community program. Thomas had given Jake control over a new initiative, one that would help struggling families get back on their feet. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just months ago, he'd been selling his blood just to make rent. Now, he had the power to change lives. "Can I help?" Emily asked, leaning forward with interest. Jake nodded, pushing a few applications toward her. "Tell me which ones you think need help the most." As Emily read through the stories, her face softened with empathy. "This lady has 3 kids, Dad, and she works 2 jobs, just like you used to." Maria Rodriguez? Jake read the name. Single mother, working as a waitress and cleaning houses. He made a note on the application. "We can help her." They spent the next hour going through applications together. Jake explained to Emily how the program worked, offering job training, medical care, and temporary housing assistance. It was everything he'd needed when he was at his lowest point. "Mr. Williams?" His assistant poked her head in. "The first group of program participants is here for orientation." Jake stood, straightening his tie. "Ready to meet some new friends?" he asked Emily. She nodded enthusiastically, following him to the conference room. Inside, 15 people sat nervously in their chairs, their expressions a mirror of what Jake had felt on his first day here. Some wore threadbare clothes, others clutched worn resumes. All carried hope in their eyes. "Welcome," Jake began, his voice warm and steady. "I know exactly how you're feeling right now. The uncertainty, the fear, the desperate need to provide for your families." He paused, making eye contact with each person. "I was where you are, not long ago." As Jake shared his story, the struggle, after losing his wife, working multiple jobs, selling his blood, he watched their faces transform from anxiety to understanding. Emily stood beside him, a living testament to how lives could change. "This program isn't charity," Jake explained. "It's an investment in your future, in your family's futures. We'll provide training, healthcare, and support. All we ask is your commitment to building a better life." After the orientation, Jake took Emily to lunch at their favorite diner, the same one where they'd once scraped by on dollar menu items. Now, they ordered whatever they wanted, but Jake never forgot the feeling of counting every penny. "Dad?" Emily asked, stirring her milkshake. "Are we going to visit Mom today?" Jake reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Yes, sweetheart. I think it's time." They drove to the cemetery in comfortable silence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the headstones as they walked the familiar path to Sarah's grave. Emily carried a bouquet of yellow roses, her mother's favorite. At the grave, Emily knelt down, arranging the flowers carefully. "Mom would be proud of us, wouldn't she?" Jake's throat tightened. "She would, baby. So proud." He wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close. "You're healthy now, and we're helping other families who need it. That's exactly what your mom would have wanted." They stood there together, the gentle breeze rustling through the trees. Jake thought about how far they'd come from the brink of homelessness to having the means to help others avoid that fate. The weight of his success felt different now, balanced by the purpose he'd found in giving back. Emily touched the headstone gently. "I wish she could see everything that's changed." "She can," Jake said softly. "And I think she'd be happy knowing that our struggles helped us understand how to help others." As they walked back to the car, Emily slipped her hand into Jake's. "Dad, can we stop by the blood bank tomorrow? I want to thank Thomas again." Jake smiled, remembering the day he'd first met Thomas, how desperate and suspicious he'd been. "Of course we can. He's part of our family now, isn't he?" Emily nodded, her face brightening. "Yeah, he is." Jake looked back at Sarah's grave one last time. His wife would have loved seeing their daughter so healthy, so full of compassion for others. She would have understood his journey from desperation to purpose. Most importantly, she would have been proud of the way they'd turned their pain into hope for others. In the car, Emily pulled out one of the program applications she'd sneaked from his desk. "Can we help this family next, Dad?" Jake glanced at the paper. Another single parent. Another story of struggle and determination. "Yes, sweetheart, we can help them all." The autumn breeze rustled through the towering oak and maple trees, their branches heavy with leaves painted in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. The gentle wind sent the colorful foliage cascading down like nature's confetti, creating a carpet of rustling beauty across Central Park's meandering paths. Jake sat on the familiar wooden bench, his weathered hands resting on his knees as he watched Emily chase after a particularly vibrant red maple leaf that seemed determined to dance just out of her reach. Her delighted squeals of laughter rang out across the open meadow, pure and uninhibited, echoing off the distant trees and mixing with the sounds of other children playing nearby. The melody of her joy wrapped around Jake's heart like a warm embrace, filling spaces inside him that had been hollow and aching for far too long. He found himself smiling without thinking about it, his face relaxing into an expression of contentment he'd almost forgotten was possible. Thomas settled beside him on the bench, and Jake couldn't help but notice how different his friend looked today. Gone was the crisp business suit and polished leather shoes that had once seemed like armor. Instead, Thomas wore faded jeans that looked like they'd actually been lived in, and a cable-knit sweater in soft navy blue that made him appear younger, more approachable. The transformation in his appearance perfectly mirrored the evolution of their relationship over these past remarkable months. The mysterious, slightly intimidating businessman who had first extended that life-changing offer was nowhere to be found. In his place sat someone who had gradually, naturally, become an integral part of their small family. "She looks so much better," Thomas observed, his voice carrying a note of wonder as he watched Emily finally capture her prize leaf and hold it up triumphantly toward the sky. "It's honestly hard to believe she was lying in that hospital bed just a few months ago, so pale and still." Jake nodded slowly, feeling that familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he remembered those terrifying weeks. "I never thought we'd be here," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There were times when I thought." He stopped abruptly, unable to give voice to the dark, desperate thoughts that had haunted him during Emily's illness. The memories of those sleepless nights spent pacing hospital corridors, of feeling utterly helpless as his daughter fought for her health, still had the power to steal his breath. "But you didn't give up," Thomas reminded him gently, his hand briefly touching Jake's shoulder in a gesture of quiet support. "Even when everything seemed impossible, you kept fighting for her. That's what matters now." Emily came running back to them, her small chest rising and falling rapidly from her exertion, her cheeks flushed a healthy pink from the crisp autumn air. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of pure excitement that only children could manage, and she clutched her captured maple leaf like it was the most precious treasure in the world. "Look what I finally caught," she announced breathlessly, holding the leaf up for their inspection. "It's perfect. Can we get ice cream now? Please?" Jake glanced at his watch instinctively, then caught himself and smiled at the irony. There had been a time, not so long ago, when such a simple, innocent request would have sent him spiraling into a panic about money, calculating and recalculating whether they could afford such a small luxury, weighing it against rent and groceries and all the other endless expenses that had once seemed insurmountable. Now, the question didn't even register as a concern. "Of course, sweetheart," he said easily, pushing himself up from the bench. "Thomas, would you like to join us for this very important ice cream mission?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Thomas replied, standing and brushing a few stray leaves from his jeans, his smile genuine and warm. They walked together down the tree-lined path that wound its way toward the cheerful red and white-striped ice cream cart, Emily practically bouncing with each step as she skipped between them. Jake noticed with a growing warmth in his chest how naturally she reached for both their hands, her small fingers weaving through theirs as if Thomas had always been part of their daily routine, their family traditions. The gesture was so unconscious, so trusting, that it brought an unexpected lump to Jake's throat. At the ice cream cart, Emily pressed her nose against the glass display case, studying her options with the serious concentration of a food critic. "I want chocolate chip, please," she finally announced to the vendor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who clearly enjoyed serving children. Jake and Thomas both opted for vanilla, and they found a perfect spot on a grassy hill near the playground where Emily could watch other children swinging and climbing while she savored her treat. "Do you remember when we first met?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice thoughtful as he watched Emily carefully navigate around the chocolate chips in her ice cream, trying to make each bite last. "You could barely look me in the eye. You held yourself so rigid, like you were ready to bolt at any moment." Jake let out a soft laugh, shaking his head at the memory. "I was suspicious of everything back then. Couldn't believe anyone would want to help without having some kind of hidden agenda. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to reveal what you really wanted from me." "And now?" Thomas asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Now I know better," Jake said, watching as Emily finished her ice cream and carefully wiped her hands on the napkin he'd given her. "Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the family you choose means just as much as the family you're born into." Thomas's expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. "You've helped me just as much, you know. Both of you have, in ways I didn't even realize I needed." He paused, his gaze following Emily as she ran toward the swings. "I had everything money could buy: houses, cars, investments, success that most people only dream of. But I was lonely in a way that no amount of wealth could fix. All that success meant nothing without someone to share it with, someone to care about." Jake felt a deep understanding pass between them. The past year had been a journey of discovery for both of them, teaching him that true wealth wasn't measured in bank balances or possessions, but in moments exactly like this one, sitting on a blanket in the park on a perfect autumn afternoon, watching his daughter's face light up with pure happiness, sharing simple pleasures with someone who had become as dear to him as family. Emily had made her way to the swing set and was now soaring through the air, her legs pumping with determination as she tried to swing higher and higher. Her face was tilted up toward the sky, eyes closed, as if she could feel the wind carrying her toward the clouds. Jake watched her with a mixture of pride and wonder, remembering all those countless sleepless nights when he'd lain awake, worrying about her future. The times when he'd felt like he was failing her as a father, when the weight of responsibility had seemed too heavy to bear. "She's absolutely amazing," Thomas said, following Jake's gaze with obvious affection. "Just like her father." The simple words hit Jake with unexpected force, filling him with a surge of pride that went beyond Emily to encompass himself as well. He'd faced his deepest fears, swallowed his pride to accept help when he needed it most, and discovered reserves of strength and resilience he hadn't known he possessed. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of despair so dark he'd wondered if he'd ever see light again. But it had led them here, to this moment of perfect, peaceful contentment. The late afternoon sun continued its gentle descent toward the horizon, casting increasingly long shadows across the grass, as Emily played with the tireless energy that seemed to define childhood. Other families came and went around them, parents pushing toddlers on swings, older children racing across the playground equipment, teenagers playing frisbee in the distance. But Jake remained completely focused on his daughter, trying to memorize every detail of her unbridled happiness. Her ponytail swung back and forth in rhythm with the swing, catching the golden light, and her face wore an expression of pure joy that made his heart feel like it might burst. "Higher, Daddy," she called out across the playground, her voice carried on the evening breeze. "Watch how high I can go. I bet I can touch the clouds." Jake stood up from their spot on the hill, brushing grass from his jeans as he moved closer to the swing set. "I see you, sweetheart," he called back, cupping his hands around his mouth. "You're doing amazing. You're practically flying." Thomas joined him at the edge of the playground, and they stood shoulder to shoulder, both watching Emily's determined efforts to swing higher than any child had ever swung before. The simple act of standing there together, sharing this moment of parental pride and affection, spoke volumes about the incredible distance they'd traveled from that first awkward meeting at the blood donation center. They had evolved from desperate strangers bound together by circumstance into something far more meaningful, a chosen family built on trust, mutual respect, and genuine care. As the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in increasingly brilliant shades of orange and pink, Emily's boundless energy finally began to show signs of waning. She slowed her swinging gradually, then jumped off with a final burst of enthusiasm and ran back to them. Her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly mussed from her adventures. She was breathless but beaming, practically glowing with satisfaction. "That was the best swinging ever," she announced, throwing her arms around Jake's waist in an impromptu hug. "Can we come back tomorrow? And the day after that? Can we make this our special place?" Jake smoothed her windblown hair with gentle fingers, marveling at how soft and healthy it felt. "We'll see about tomorrow, sweetheart," he said with a smile. "But maybe we can make this a regular weekend tradition. Would you like that?" "Yes," Emily exclaimed, then turned to Thomas with hopeful eyes. "You'll come too, right? It's not the same without you." Thomas's expression grew tender, and Jake could see how much Emily's easy acceptance and affection meant to him. "I wouldn't miss it," Thomas promised, crouching down to her eye level. "We're a team now, remember?" As they began gathering their few belongings and preparing to leave, Jake took one last long look around the park that had become so special to them. The setting sun had transformed the sky into a masterpiece of color, brilliant oranges melting into deep purples, with streaks of pink and gold threading through the clouds like brushstrokes on a canvas. The autumn trees stood silhouetted against this magnificent backdrop, their nearly bare branches reaching toward the heavens like grateful arms. Emily walked between them as they made their way back down the winding path, once again claiming both their hands and swinging them back and forth as she chattered excitedly about all the things she wanted to do on their next visit. Her voice carried clearly in the crisp evening air, full of plans and dreams, and the kind of hopeful enthusiasm that reminded Jake why fighting for their future had been worth every struggle. A profound sense of peace settled over Jake's shoulders like a warm blanket, replacing the crushing weight of worry and fear that had been his constant companion for so long. The anxiety that had once kept him awake at night, the desperate calculations about money and bills and survival, had been replaced by something infinitely lighter and brighter. Hope. Not just hope for getting through another day, but hope for Emily's bright future. Hope for the continuing growth of their unconventional but loving family. Hope for joy and laughter and countless more afternoons like this one. Thomas caught his eye as they walked, and they shared a look of complete understanding. No words were necessary to express what they both felt. Profound gratitude for the unexpected turns life had taken, for the bonds they'd forged through hardship and trust, for the second chances they'd been given when they'd thought all was lost. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life came disguised as disasters, and sometimes the people who changed your world forever entered your life in the most unlikely ways. Emily's excited voice continued to fill the evening air as she planned elaborate adventures for their future park visits, her imagination spinning tales of treasure hunts and picnics, and maybe even bringing a kite next time. Jake squeezed her small hand gently, his heart so full of love and contentment that he thought it might overflow. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time since his wife's death, he wasn't just surviving, wasn't just putting one foot in front of the other and hoping to make it through another day. He was truly living, embracing each precious moment with joy instead of fear, looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. The park grew quieter around them as other families headed home for dinner and evening routines. The autumn leaves continued their eternal dance in the gentle breeze, swirling and spinning in small tornadoes of color before settling onto the path. Jake watched them with new eyes, seeing them not as symbols of endings and loss, but as reminders that change, while sometimes frightening, could lead to the most beautiful transformations. He looked down at his daughter, her face still glowing with happiness and health, then over at Thomas, whose presence had become as natural and necessary as breathing, and knew with absolute certainty that despite all the hardship they'd endured, all the moments when he thought they might not make it, they had not just survived. They had emerged stronger, happier, and more complete than ever before. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Jake, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.